Vampa looked up as Dantes approached, his gaze sharp and assessing, as if measuring a potential threat and quickly dismissing it. "Who are you?" he asked, unwrapping the cloth from his hands. "My name is Ed. I'm a friend of Vera's. She asked me to bring you this." Dantes reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded piece of paper he'd been given. As Vampa met him at the bottom of the stairs, his movements reminded Dantes of a cat walking a fence post, graceful, deliberate, and utterly silent. He was larger than any of the fighters Dantes had just watched brawl, yet every motion carried a disciplined economy. Even as he took the letter, unfolding it with care, he exuded a quiet intensity. Dantes noticed the subtle way he sniffed the paper, a detail too minute for most to catch. Vampa's eyes scanned the letter quickly before he nodded to himself. "I will watch over the Vixen and Vera. Keep them safe." He looked at Dantes again. "Leave." Without another word, he turned back toward the pit, gathering clothing and weapons. "Can I ask how you know Vera?" "No," he said simply, pulling a thick wool shirt over his head. Dantes sighed. He knew when he was talking to a brick wall and decided not to push. "Thank you for looking after her and the girls." He turned and exited the building, passing the guard, who was now fully asleep. With practiced ease, he lifted a jingling purse from the man's pocket before slipping into the main streets. The Vixen remained undisturbed, so he began the long walk toward the nearest of his gardens. Even as he navigated the guild district, he overheard exaggerated retellings of Gavain's victory in the arena. By the time he reached Lowdown, Gavain had gone from defeating 4 trained combatants to single-handedly vanquishing 100 warriors, while a seagull pecked at his testicles. As he neared his garden, he felt the familiar tug of the thread connecting him to it, vibrating in anticipation of his return. This was the smallest of his gardens, just a few fruits, vegetables, and a single tree seed, all beginning to sprout. He reached out with his energy, testing their responses. The knowledge from his initiation surfaced, along with memories of his conversation with the god of bats. Feeding the hungry alone was not enough. Balance had to be maintained. Scanning the block, he noticed a rusted collection of spiked metal atop a roof. He climbed up and pushed the debris off before gathering scattered wood scraps into a corner. An empty house bordering the garden caught his eye, remarkably intact. He reshaped a branch into a pry, tore away some of the boards, and opened it to the elements, creating shelter for animals. A buried basin was repositioned to catch rainwater. Satisfied, he watered his plants, sensing their needs, shifting them where conflicts arose, even relocating a sapling with a carefully reshaped branch-turned trowel. Extending his senses, he detected birds eyeing the cleared roof and a rat burrowing into the woodpile. The line of power connecting him to the garden felt stronger, more fluid, though still dwarfed by the connection to his original garden in the Underprison. As a final touch, he buried a stash of gold and gems in an unmarked section, an emergency fallback. He tended his other 2 gardens in the same way, reinforcing their balance. When he finished, they were far more stable, though none rivaled the Underprison's garden in sheer strength. Returning to his primary garden, he greeted the bats roosting within and checked on the Vixen. He sent his connected animals to scout the area, and it wasn't long before he located Vampa, already inside the brothel. Clad in a comically small apron, he stood in the kitchen, pouring a dark red wine over a beautifully seared cut of meat. Dantes hadn't expected him to cook, much less embed himself inside the Vixen. He'd assumed Vampa would watch from the shadows. But Vera had orchestrated this. It was clever. Those Mondego had placed a monitor the Vixen wouldn't question a cook, a bouncer, or even a regular client. Relieved, Dantes left his animals to keep watch. He could see his favor tick upward, reflected in the shifting tattoos on his arm. Not his preferred type of gold, but satisfying nonetheless. With the Vixen temporarily secured, he turned his thoughts to the escaped prisoners. If Wayne or Merle were among them, and if he could free them from their collars, he'd gain powerful allies. He also needed to check on his old garden. Now that he understood the risk it posed, he had to mitigate the danger. If the escapees had intel, he could adjust his approach accordingly. Opening his pack, he sifted through Pasha's notes. Weeks of study had granted him an intimate understanding of Mondegoo's operations, where shipments arrived, how they were stored, and who funded them. He knew the key players, but enchantments on certain buildings prevented rats and vermin from infiltrating. He needed a mage, one with loose morals or someone he could control. Ideally, he'd find a collared escapee, but time was short. An uncollared mage under his thumb could serve multiple purposes, including aiding the collared ones. Then there was Danglars. He was entwined in Mondegoo's network, and Dantes wanted revenge on him just as much. Pasha suspected Danglars manipulated legal authority to shield certain ships from inspections while ensuring those outside Mondegoo's control faced scrutiny. Fortunately, Dantes didn't need to untangle the full workings of Mondegoo's operation, just enough to break it. Sabotage was far easier than construction. That was why he'd stuck to thievery with his gang rather than deeper machinations. Less room for error. But once his revenge was complete, what then? Regular thievery had lost its appeal. He worked through his thoughts, strategizing his next steps. He could cover ground alone, but to move quickly, he needed an equal. His gaze landed on Jacopo, who was gorging himself on a piece of rotten fruit. I think we may need to split up for a while. The Bitter Wife was not the finest establishment in Rendhold, not by a long shot, but it certainly did its best to live up to its name. Gambling, drinking, whoring, and even fighting, if you had a taste for that sort of thing, were all readily available to its patrons. Situated southeast of the Academy Towers, it was one of the only bad areas near uptown, a fact that made it both convenient and dangerous. Dantes had not been familiar with this particular den of sin when he was thrown into the pit, but the previous day, he had taken the time to scout it out with his 4- and 6-legged allies. He wore a dark gray coat he had stolen, a black hat, rings on each of his fingers, and a gold chain around his neck. The bouncer barely spared him a glance as he walked in. He looked like a man with money to spend and was clean enough that none of the girls would complain. He headed straight to the bar, where a dwarven woman was busy pouring beer into mugs, swiftly distributing them to a group of 10 patrons who had arrived before him. Taking a seat at the bar, he casually scanned the gambling tables, quickly identifying his mark. The man was long and lean, his brown hair touched with gray, and his sharp purple eyes darted over his surroundings with an analytical glint. His gaunt face suggested he frequently forgot to eat, but his movements were filled with energy. His clothes were casual, but the stink of the academy clung to him. Dantes had learned about him from Dario while searching for mages of questionable ethics. Felix was the perfect target. A tenured professor with little talent for combat magic, he excelled at enchantments, bindings, and breaking spells. Most importantly, he loved to gamble, a fatal flaw in anyone you wanted control over. Felix sat at a white drake table, holding his 5 cards with a smug smile. No one else at the table looked pleased. With a practiced flourish, he laid down his hand, eliciting a chorus of groans. He pulled a small pile of coins and a silver ring toward him, carefully organizing his winnings while another player reshuffled the deck. The table was full, but judging by the dwindling stacks of coins, a seat would be opening soon. "What do you have?" asked the dwarven bartender, a bit out of breath, but managing to keep impatience from her voice. She was stocky, with a square jaw, but her warm brown eyes softened her appearance. "Something strong and brown, preferably the same shade as your eyes." She blinked a few times. "We don't have anything quite that shade." "That doesn't surprise me. Too unique. Just whatever's closest." She reddened slightly, grabbed a bottle, and poured him a drink. He slid her a silver and threw the drink back, enjoying the burn as it went down. The Vixen had been great, but their focus on wine had left something to be desired. After years of drinking prison hooch, he preferred something with more bite. "Thank you." She nodded and moved to serve another customer before quietly refilling his glass. He nursed the drink, keeping an eye on the table. The Bitter Wife was in decent shape, but there were still rats here and there. He directed one to a spot in the wall behind Felix, where it found a loose nail and started pushing it out. Once removed, it left a tiny peephole through which Dantes could barely make out Felix's hand. The rat blinked, and the minotaur in Felix's grip suddenly became a blue wyvern. Dantes smirked and took another sip. A fellow degenerate. The bartender glanced at him. Another drink? He nodded, and she poured again. The tables, he asked casually, they got any enchantments to keep mages from cheating? Academy's not far. She nodded. Aye, sir. They don't stop magic outright, but there's some enchantment that makes it real obvious. Outside, I get a soft tone in my ears when magic's about. In here, when a cocky student tries something, it's like an eagle screaming in my skull. Dantes nodded. He hadn't felt any tingling in his fingers, which meant Felix had found a way around their detection. In Midtown, a mage could cheat with impunity, but even winning too honestly there could get you killed. He slid her another silver. Thanks. She had the coin. Sir, you haven't even finished drinking the first silver's worth. That's to keep serving me when I go to that table. He pointed toward Felix's group, where a man was shaking with sobs as Felix and another player split the pile in the center. She nodded. He slid her a third silver. And this is just a tip. Standing, he strode toward the table, passing the weeping man as he made his way to the exit. He smiled at the remaining players and gestured toward the empty seat. Looks like you've got an opening. Mind if I join? The table sized him up, taking in his rings, gold chain, and fine coat. I'd say you're welcome, said a heavy-set woman to his right. Long as you don't cry when you lose. Can't stand a man who cries. Dantes chuckled and took the seat. Oh, I do cry when I lose. But I don't think that'll be a problem. The woman laughed, and a few others at the table followed suit. Felix lifted the deck and slid it across the table. New guy deals first round. Dantes smiled, taking the cards. He thumbed the edge, listening to the crisp shuffle of paper against paper, then cut and merged them with practiced precision before dealing 5 cards to each player. It had been a while since he'd played. Dice were simpler in the pit, easier to make, harder to break, and effortless to steal. But as he dealt each hand, ensuring he had a decent but not perfect spread, he found the old familiarity returning. He picked up his cards, a 3-dragon run. Strong, but not unbeatable. He watched as the others inspected their hands, his focus lingering on Felix. Through the rat's eyes, he saw Felix's mated pair and 3-color changeup, a superior hand. Dantes tossed in 2 silver, accepting a drink from the bartender with a nod. The other players called and placed their bets. He held his hand, smiling, while the others swapped 1 or 2 cards. Dantes raised by another silver, prompting the heavy-set woman to match and raise again. 2 players folded. Felix, of course, won the round. Are the tears coming? The woman asked with a grin. Dantes winked. I haven't lost until I'm out of money. The game played out, not just between Felix and Dantes, but among all the players. Dantes kept his wins modest and his losses obvious, never dipping too low. Between seeing hands through the rat's eyes and his own nimble fingers, he had every advantage. Felix, too, was careful, only ever switching 1 card at a time. He wasn't creating duplicates, just replacing what was already in the deck. It was smart. It also meant, as the deck thinned, his options did too. 1 by 1, the table emptied until only Dantes and Felix remained. The heavy-set woman stayed to watch, dealing the cards. Dantes stopped being conservative with his wins, his pile growing 5 times the size of Felix's. Felix was sweating now, confused at how he was losing. No one offered him sympathy. Dantes leaned back, glancing at Felix's dwindling stack. Maybe take what's left and walk. Felix scowled. No, I'm due for a win. Dantes smirked and lifted his glass. Then let's make it interesting.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Jacopo moved quickly through the city, using the mental map Dantes had given him to move toward uptown. Dantes hadn't frequented that part of the city, as most were turned away at the gates unless they could prove they had business there. But there were ways through for those who really wanted to be there, and Dantes had the distinct memories of being escorted through for his sentencing to the pit. Jacopo wasn't bound by the same restrictions, though, and simply squeezed through the front gate. The first impression of uptown Jacopo had was that of how different it was from the rest of the city. The streets were smooth instead of filled with potholes, the building free of cracks and grime, and the people all smelled of flowers and fresh water. He immediately hated it. He moved away from the gates and further into uptown, sticking to what little shadows there were as he did so. The two legs that were also different from what Jacopo had grown used to. They were more distinct, less mixed up as Dantes was. The tall, pointed-eared ones lacked any evidence of tusks. The wide, short ones had no purple or green in their beards, and the human ones were distinctly uninteresting to look at, though they seemed to cover themselves in much finer cloths to compensate. If Jacopo had been a two-leg, or cared more to learn about them, he may have known that having a nobility made up of so many different races was a very rare thing. Most nations' ruling class were made up of only one or two separate races, but Rendhold was different. When Rendhold had been founded, it had no nobles. It was ruled by the people and existed a border city between two small kingdoms. Because of the murkiness of the authority and ownership surrounding the city, it became a popular place for exiled nobles and politicians to make their home, bringing with themselves vast resources. Those nobles were from many different lines, but eventually they all agreed that Rendhold had tremendous potential. Over time, they slowly took over the city and made themselves the new ruling class, establishing a new nobility. Exiled nobles or second sons could still be granted noble status and protection when moving to Rendhold for a price. The council still only allowed those of noble blood to serve. Jacopo didn't know or care about any of this, of course. He was a rat and had more practical concerns that just so happened to be occasionally superseded by his soul binding to a two-leg. The buildings were also very different from what he'd grown used to. They were larger, and each of them had a distinct look to it. The green and tusked two legs seemed to mostly congregate around the buildings made of stone with narrow windows, some barely big enough for Jacopo to fit through. The squat ones favored low stone buildings that seemed to continue underground, and the tall and pointer-eared ones favored spindly homes of wood that seemed higher than should be possible, and were surrounded by fresh gardens. For what he'd gotten from Dantes, this area was where the newest and poorest nobles lived, and where the great market connected to the rest of the city. He needed to go deeper in, closer to the mage towers, to find the administrative district. He wove through alleys nicer than the main roads in Midtown, and avoided a fat cat by jumping through some narrow fencing that it couldn't get through, before making it to his goal. The buildings that were very different to the others he'd seen in Midtown. Built of black stone, high and imperious, with white accent columns and gold icons. In the center of the square were a series of statues of all of the gods involved in governance. The Father, Justice, and a smattering of others that Jacopo had no clue about, as he didn't much care about what gods the two-legged races worshipped. He made his way to the statues in the center, climbing the largest of them, the Father, and hunching down on his shoulders to watch the square. It was midday and busy, and he extended his senses out, reaching out to other rats, bats, and roaches in the area to watch everything from multiple angles. He could not hold as many eyes in his mind as Dantes could, but his ability to inhabit them and read their senses was much keener, so more than made up for it. There were far fewer vermin in this part of the city, another reason to dislike it, and he found that much like the bakeries he'd attempted to burgle in Midtown, every building was sealed from the rats he sent to test their entrances. Stolen content warning. This tale belongs on Royal Road. Report any occurrences elsewhere. He brought up in his mind the images of the people he was looking for. The female magister who had bound Sin to the pit, and Danglars. He sat and scanned for a long time. He wished Dantes had the sense to provide him with a scent for either of them. He supposed the strange, shape-shifting woman probably couldn't have helped with that, but Danglars, he was certain Dantes had known well enough to be aware of his smell. He sent his senses out to check on Dantes, who allowed him with a mental handshake. The connection took more effort at this distance, but it was possible with some focus from both of them. Dantes was looking at the cards in his hand. Jacopo had no idea what he was looking at, but got the impression that Dantes was satisfied with what he had. "Any luck so far?" asked Dantes as he tossed a couple silver into a pile and some type of odd ritual that Jacopo didn't bother asking for clarification on. No, I am here, but neither of the two legs have appeared. Dantes took a sip of his drink. Well, even if you don't locate either of them, I should have a way to break the enchantment that keeps you from entering certain buildings soon. It would help to know either of their locations first, though. Jacopo gave a mental nod. That was the reason he agreed to do this instead of what he'd originally had planned for the day: feeding, fighting, and fucking. He wanted no place to be barred from him. Added novel Benedette. Dantes lifted a new hand up in front of his face and expertly kept a neutral expression despite the terrible hand he'd drawn. I need my focus back here. Get a bit more time, a couple hours. If they don't show up, I'll meet you back at the garden. Jacopo broke the connection without the courtesy of a goodbye. Such things didn't really matter to him, and returned his focus to the square in front of him. After another hour of watching, he found Danglars. Jacopo didn't recognize him at first. Dante's memories were dated. While Danglars had been on the tall side, just a bit shorter than Mondego and skinny, his posture had deteriorated and his waistline had nearly doubled from what it had been. His dark blue hair, the only real indication of his distant gnomish ancestry, had begun to recede as well, making an already steep widow's peak particularly precarious. Jacopo leapt down from the statue of the father and weaved his way through the legs of the crowd. Unlike in Midtown, the people of Uptown didn't look down. They were unconcerned with what was below them, and unlike Midtowners, didn't need to worry so much about what they might step in. He made it to Dangler's vicinity and began following him, listening in on his conversation. He was speaking to 3 young female attendants that all had red hair, though they were each of a different race. Make sure to push back my meeting with Serpent tomorrow. For what reason, sir? Whoring, but make up a better excuse than that. Yes, sir. I also need you to prepare a brief regarding the land deal, but make it a bad one. The opposing party gave me a tasty bribe. Yes, sir. Would you like us to handle the meeting with the dock authorities as well? Danglars stopped. No, I'll handle that as always. Jacopo tailed them until they reached one of the lower black buildings. There were words written outside, but Jacopo couldn't read unless Dantes was there to interpret it with him. Have a meal brought to me in my office. Something fatty and decadent. Yes, sir. And he looked over each of the women, his eyes settling on the human one. Desha, join me in my office, would you? The woman swallowed. Are you sure, sir? You have your appointment with Doja at the Cruel Lady? Should you not save your energy? I will decide what I have energy for. Yes, sir. The woman looked thoroughly depressed, and the other 2 relieved as they walked inside. Jacopo took note of the building and attempted to enter it, finding it blocked just as the others had been. Still, he'd gotten what he'd come for, and Dantes owed him some fine food and drink for his effort. He quickly made his way out of Uptown and got back onto the dirtier, unkempt streets that he'd begun to consider home. Dantes watered his 4th garden, drawing his black hilted stiletto to trim a few browning leaves from a bush as he listened to the gossiping of pigeons on the freshly cleared roof behind him. How was the park? Added novel Benedette. Bad. Old woman wasn't there again. Miss her dearly. Strange. She'd show up even in the rain. Such tasty crumbs she gave. She saved me from a cat once. Attacked him with her cane. Such a brave woman. Dantes had been listening in on a lot of animals since his initiation. It was interesting the differences between them. They all had similar priorities: food, water, and shelter, but they approached all of it from a very different framework. Bats were very social, almost like a single large family. Rats were like a family too, but one of criminals they'd share, but only after making sure they got theirs first. Roaches didn't really talk, though he felt general impressions from them. Cats typically ignored him unless he had something they wanted. Birds, of which pigeons were what he encountered the most, reminded him most of the women at a whorehouse after the day was done. Gossiping, bragging, and somehow keeping track of more than 100 different people through their little conversations. He finished pruning a branch, thinking that he should invest in actual tools sometime soon, and poured some water from a flash over his hands to rinse them. He missed the vixen and his regular access to baths and whores. He turned his attention to the pigeons. This woman, do you know where she lives? The pigeons looked down at him. Oh, he's the one that can speak? I expected it to be one of those short, bearded ones. Yes, I can speak. The woman you're speaking of, where can I find her? Another pigeon, this one gray with flecks of emerald green at his neck, stepped forward. Why do you want to know? Dantes shrugged. Want to see if I can help her out. He had been looking for more ways to earn favor with birds, and this seemed like something that could help. Bats had been very useful. They were great flyers, and their senses were very acute, but they had their limitations. They couldn't fly very high, and using them during the day cost him a heavy amount of favor, which was slow to build with them. Even if pigeons fulfilled the same role as them, it would still be worth it to court them. Nothing wrong with having a diverse range of options. I don't know, but I think Red Feather does. Dantes moved to a post over which his coat was slung and threw it on. He had his meeting with Felix later in the evening to get whatever item he'd prepared to help him break the anti-vermin enchantment, so he'd been focused on garden maintenance and building favor that day. This seemed like a worthy endeavor. Take me to her. What followed was a series of back and forths with various pigeons. One wouldn't know exactly, but would know someone who did, and all of that work to slowly get him closer and closer until Dantes wound up in a small slum on the border of the docks and Midtown in front of an old square brick house with well-kept flowers sitting in the window. He hesitated at the door, realizing that he hadn't exactly thought through how he would approach the situation. He couldn't exactly tell her that he was there because of pigeons. He shrugged and knocked on the door. He'd improvise. He was confident he could come up with something on the fly. The tale has been taken without authorization. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. He heard a series of surprisingly heavy footsteps and held out his arm so that Jacopo could leap off of it and peer through the window. Through Jacopo's eyes, he saw what was indeed an old woman, but he hadn't been expecting her to be a full-blooded orc who, in spite of the small spectacles and gray hair, was holding a heavy spike club as she stood behind the door. I told you all, I don't have the money. Leave me alone. Dantes quickly referenced what she said with what information he'd gathered about the area. Mondego controlled it, but it was on the border of what he fully controlled. His goons frequently bullied protection money out of businesses and residents. He assumed they'd threatened this woman, and she was now afraid to leave her home. Though based on her stature, he was surprised by that. They must have been some intimidating goons. I'm not here for money, ma'am, but are you by any chance related to a... He reached through his mind, searching for a common orc name. Crushkin? He saw the woman lower her club slightly through Jacopo's eyes. I have a cousin by that name, yes. Well, I'm sorry to tell you this, but he's unfortunately passed away. She put her club down and opened the door. Crushy is dead? She asked sadly. I feel like I lose someone else every year. What happened? Was it during a Leviathan hunt? Dantes smiled internally, finding exactly the way in he needed. That's right. A particularly profitable one, actually. I'm here on behalf of his ship. You're the only relative we've been able to find. Did he have a wife? Children? She shook her head. No. He was always bad with women, Crushy. Got too handsy too quickly. Dantes nodded. Ah, well, the final profits for the hunt, his cut, as well as his cuts from a couple previous outings. The company normally pockets those to pay for replacing employees that have passed, but due to his death being pivotal in the last hunt, an exception has been made, and his family is to receive the money. Normally, this is the part of the scam where he'd mention something along the lines of her needing to give him some money to pay for the legal fees required for the transfer of funds. It was an age-old scam, and one he himself had done a few times when he was younger, though it hadn't worked as well when his voice was cracking. In this case, though, he wanted to give the woman money, which made things easier. How much? She asked. Her eyes were narrowed suspiciously. Hard to take good news seriously in Midtown, where she was familiar with the scam. Dantes did some quick mental math. 30 gold, actually. Her eyes widened a bit. 30? He nodded. Well, with Leviathan hunts, things are always feast or famine. He happened to die at a time of feast. If he'd lived, he'd been set for years. She nodded, collecting herself, and reaching casually back toward her club. And what exactly do I need to do to retrieve this money? He smiled. She was familiar with the scam. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small sack of gold. I suppose all you need to do is take this from my hand. She looked both ways and snatched the sack from his hand with a speed that heavily contrasted her age. He nodded at her and looked around at her house. With this much, you could afford to move to a nicer neighborhood. Maybe something closer to that public garden a few blocks down. He smiled. Anyway, ma'am, you have a nice day. He felt Jacopo crawl up his leg as he walked away from her. Giving up money for nothing? Asked Jacopo. Wasteful. If it leads to me gaining a blessing from the pigeon god, it will have been worth it. He cracked his fingers. There are a few ways to spend gold. You can use it to further your goals. You can use it to have fun. You can use it to have nice things. And, of course, you need it to survive in general. Sitting on it has no value, though. The richest, most miserly old men and women in Uptown often die on piles of unspent wealth that their children bicker over. I'd rather spend it. The rat that hoards food is the first to die when it becomes scarce. Dantes nodded. There's that too. If you spend it on making friends, it can certainly help in the long run. It's a tool, not a goal in and of itself. Dantes walked through alleys, making his way to the Guild District. Are you ready to break into those bakeries that were closed to you? He asked Jacopo. He sensed Jacopo's excitement. To start with, yes. Dantes and Jacopo were nearly at their appointed meeting place when he decided to send some rats and roaches ahead of them. He found Felix waiting for him, clearly sweating profusely and pacing back and forth. A bad sign. Dantes stopped walking and watched him a bit longer, letting him sweat. Felix peered down the alley and very carefully lifted up some loose cloth that was at the alley's entrance. Dantes could see, through a bat hanging upside down, that there was some kind of arcane mark beneath it. Felix meant to trap him, it seemed. He thinks to be the breadcrumb in a spring trap, said Jacopo. Dantes smiled. Let's see how he reacts when he's the one that falls into it instead. Dantes climbed quickly and easily onto the roof of the building behind, which was the alley that Felix was still pacing in. He made his way to the edge of the building and shifted into rat form before shifting back when Felix's back was turned. He crept quietly behind him and gave him a gentle shove directly onto the top of the sigil he'd written on the ground. Felix let out a yelp as he landed on it, and then seemed to freeze, his eyes wide open and his body hanging suspended a foot in the air. Dantes peered at him, seeing that his eyes were mobile even though his body was frozen in place. Hello, Felix. He took a step closer to make sure that Felix could see him, and was gratified when his pupils landed on him. You all right? You seem to be having some trouble. Dantes chuckled to himself as Felix didn't respond. Honestly, not a bad idea. Render me immobile at our meeting, maybe kill me? I'm honestly a bit impressed. You didn't seem like the type. He stepped closed and started rifling in Felix's pockets. Unfortunately for you, I am, and whether or not I kill you will depend heavily on what I find in your pockets. He continued his rifling, finding a coin pouch, a tin of rolled tobacco, some burnt sticks, and finally a small key that made his fingertips tingle. It looks like you prepared what I asked for. No knife either, unless... He moved to Felix's boots where he found a simple dagger tucked into it. He slid that into the sheath he had in his sleeve, letting out a TSK, TSK, TSK as he did so. Now, I don't know much about magical theory, but I'd bet he moved the cloth off the sigil and scuffed the edge of it with his boot. Felix fell the rest of the way to the ground. Dantes watched him carefully. He didn't have any weapons on him anymore, but he was a mage, and that meant he could be dangerous. Just because Dario had told him he wasn't talented with offensive magic didn't mean that was the whole truth. He tensed his will, ready to send all the nearby vermin at him in force if he needed to. Felix looked up at him with tears welling in his eyes. Please don't kill me. Dantes stayed tense, expecting a feint of some kind, but none came. He sighed. Why would I do that? You gave me what I asked for. He held up the key. I assume this is what I asked for. Yes. Just send some wool through it, and you can create a small pocket that vermin can move through. Why a key? Symbolism is important with enchantments and seals. If you wanted to break an anti-vermin enchantment, for instance, I'd maybe tie it to a hammer. How we perceive things affects how they work. Dantes thought about it. A hammer to fully break the enchantment? Now, there was an idea. How much juice does this need? Will it run out? Maybe eventually. It's not breaking anything, just creating a window. It'll last a long time. If another mage was to look at this, would they be able to tell you'd made it? He looked confused. I suppose so. Not many can subtly alter an enchantment using another object. Dantes smiled as another method of control fell into place. So, we're even? Dantes closed the gap between them in almost no time at all. No, we're not even. I beat you in a card game by a mile, and asked you for a favor, and in return you planned to kill me. Dantes shoved him into the wall. I'm going to want more of these. I'm going to want at least one of those hammers you alluded to, and after that we'll see where we stand. He loosened his grip and dusted off Felix's jacket with his hand a bit, then looked up at him and met him eye to eye. There's no reason this needs to be hard for you. After we're through what I feel you owe me, I'll pay you for your services. How would you like more gold to gamble on cards? A case of theft. This story is not rightfully on Amazon. If you spot it, report the violation. There was a slight twinkle in his eye, just beyond the fear on his face. Dantes shook his head. I'll see you again next week. The hammer isn't as high a priority as the keys. He paused at the edge of the alley as he was walking away and took the dagger he'd taken, driving it into the coin purse he'd taken from Felix and sticking it to the wall. Try something stupid like that again, and I will kill you. He walked a few blocks, dexterously creating a small leather loop connected to the key with his left hand. Then he gave the key to Jacopo, who was able to wear the key as a kind of small necklace. They followed the smell of food to a nearby restaurant, and Dantes leaned against a wall while Jacopo skittered out of his jacket and down a nearby alley. Jacopo circled the building, finding a small crack in a far corner. He moved slowly until he hit the shield that blocked his entry. Dantes sent him brief instructions on how to use magical items, and Jacopo sent his will through the key. He strained against the shield, but felt it give. Instead of a wall, it was like pushing on cloth or flesh. He sent a bit more will through the key and made it through. He moved through the restaurant and toward the kitchen where one cook was yelling at another. He clambered onto a counter and tore a hunk of steak from a plate. He dragged it off the counter and carried it back to where he'd broken through. There was no resistance on the way out, and he crawled up Dantes' leg and back into a pocket where he tore into the steak with gusto. Dantes smiled, releasing his focus on a rat he had watching Felix drink. He wanted to be able to find him in case the key didn't work as he'd promised at a novel been at. Well, we got it tested. Now to try it out on something a bit more challenging. It took them some time, but they reached the docks without much issue. The salt air was particularly strong and blustery, with dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Dantes stood on a rooftop, watching the warehouse below as men entered and left with fair regularity, carrying goods of all kinds. After Dantes had watched Pashai intimidate his rat, Ket, Dantes had been tailing the man which had led him to the warehouse below. According to Ket, the warehouse was where the majority of Mondago's smuggling operation passed through. Pashai had been attempting to get the authority and the men to organize a raid, but the docking authority had been blocking him. With the brief conversation Dantes had heard between Danglars and his people, he had an idea of who was pulling the strings there. Dantes had found that the warehouse was beyond his ability to infiltrate alone due to the large number of guards, and it also had the anti-vermin protection that many warehouses that stored food on the docks also had. He watched through Jacopo's eyes as he pushed his way through the enchantment. Jacopo squeezed under the gap at the bottom of a closed door and made his way inside. He scurried into the darkness between two crates to avoid being seen, and slowly made his way into the rafters of the storehouse to observe what was happening. He was unimpressed by what he saw, but Dantes' excitement was building as he looked through his eyes. He saw barrels of gunpowder, vials of dust being sorted by women who'd been stripped nude to guarantee that they weren't stealing any of it, weighed by the bushel full, guns, swords, even books, and a smattering of what he assumed were offensive magic wands. It was the largest collection of valuable and smuggled goods he'd ever seen. He encouraged Jacopo to keep looking across the whole warehouse so that he could get a clearer picture. Jacopo complied and moved toward the far wall of the building, which was walled off from the rest. On that side were cages. He saw men, women, and children within them. A few of them looked as if they'd been lightly beaten, but for the most part they looked well fed and not sick. Slaves thought Dantes as he looked, or future slaves at the very least. Slavery was legal in Rendhold, but there wasn't much use for it. Frasci had use for them, as they relied on their slaves to grow crops, but Rendhold didn't produce much of its own food and could always turn to its criminals for a source of easy and free labor. Even paying people a few coppers for work seemed more economical than providing room and board and food to the labor force. Certainly, there were a few uptown nobles that kept domestic slaves, but usually those were descended from the ones brought there by Frasciid royalty. It was all beyond him, as he'd never really considered owning one or given much thought to it in general. He did know that buying and selling slaves was limited to those with special permission and authority, which he highly doubted Mondego had. Jacopo did another loop, and this time Dantes counted the guards and people working. There were nearly 50 people there. The guards were armed with blades, guns, and even wands in some cases. It was possible he could overwhelm them all if he had a full vermin marks, but even that would be difficult. He considered sending Jacopo in with a burnstick to light the gunpowder, but that was too risky to Jacopo, not to mention that any fire it caused could spread across the entirety of the docks. He'd have to consider other options, get creative. Jacopo made his way out of the building, and they met in a nearby alley. There was still more work to do. The next night, Dantes and Jacopo wove through uptown as rats, moving from block to block until they reached the administrative square. They skittered past the statues of the gods in the center, avoiding a few overworked clerks and one romantic tryst occurring under the shade of one of the columns on the council hall. They reached the building they determined was where Danglars held his office, and, staying closely together, they pushed their way through the barrier protecting it from vermin and made their way inside. There were no candles, but there were a number of small glass spheres giving off light from different rooms indicating late nights for at least a few of the magisters and their staff that worked within the building. They searched it slowly, doing their best to avoid those few remaining workers, and attempted to find Danglars' office. It took some time, but they eventually found it. A door with the name Danglars Forteville written in gold paint. Dantes attempted to squeeze beneath the door, but found that he couldn't quite fit. He and Jacopo checked the nearby halls and saw no one, so he shifted back to himself and, using his branch, picked the lock quickly. He pushed the door open gently, and seeing no one inside, he let himself in. He slid the door silently closed and looked around. The office was opulent, both in design and decoration. The walls were black with patterns of golden roses painted across them and ivory white columns in each corner. A shelf of fine imported wood along one wall was filled with books and collected correspondence. The furniture was all of the same matching contemporary style, and the desk in the upper middle was a piece of solid marble on which sat stacks of documents, opened and unopened mail, and a bowl filled with fine bread and cheese that filled the room with its scent. Dantes focused on the tips of fingertips, but detected no indication of magic. He moved toward the desk in the center, Jacopo leaping onto it and scurrying into the bowl of food while Dantes began rifling through the papers. He found a number of documents from the docking authorities, several messages to the guard involving removing Pasha from his job, and miscellaneous messages resolving other work and disputes he was a part of. It generally proved what he had already suspected of how Mondego and Danglars had worked together, but it wasn't anything particularly useful. Still, he slid a few of the letters he found particularly incriminating into his jacket. He moved over to the shelf and began sorting through it, finding mostly meetings notes from councils and committees regarding different policies and decisions. There was one about the increasing hostilities from Vicent, the inquiry as to whether they should accept fleeing political refugees from Frasciid, and other things of that nature. There were even some involving increasing domestic food production or drafting new guards to prepare for hostilities. None of it was important to Dantes or Danglars. From what he could tell, the notes were specifically prepared for Danglars by his secretaries for meetings he hadn't bothered to attend. He shook his head. He hadn't found a single personal correspondence. Danglars could be surprisingly meticulous, but that didn't make sense to Dantes. He turned his attention back to the marble desk and walked over to it. He bent down and began running his hands along the smooth stone of the desk. He sensed something off about it. Eventually, his delicate fingers felt a slight seam on it. He worked around the seam, sending in a thin shard of wood from his branch into it, and eventually found a simple mechanism. He pushed on it, and a drawer popped open. From it wafted the scent of perfume, and Dantes saw a stack of letters held down by a heavy stone seal. Dantes lifted the seal, seeing that it was emblazoned with the name Forteville, as well as the image of an open palm and a clenched fist, the emblem of the Magisters. It was Dangler's symbol of office. Dantes smiled as he pocketed it, and then he turned his attention to the letters. He lifted the first one. Hello, my little piggy. If you stumble upon this narrative on Amazon, be aware that it has been stolen from Royal Road. Please report it. I bet you're opening this and reading it in your office while your poor little secretaries are in the room with you, aren't you? You filthy, disgusting little man. Have you no shame? A magister, a member of Rendhold's nobility infected with such degeneracy. You should be punished for what you are. You should have your... Dantes skipped over 2 full pages of lurid and detailed descriptions before reaching the end of the letter. See you soon, little piggy, Mistress Doja. Dantes smelled the letter, finding that it was where the smell had been coming from. The perfume smelled of roses and leather with just a hint of blood. Dantes had to admit it was a rather nice smell, though he was far less interested in the promise that came with it than it seemed Danglars was. He had known Danglars was bent in that particular direction for some time. When they were deep in their cups, they'd had more than one talk about it, and Dantes himself was the one who suggested he act on it and book a specialist every once in a while. Still, he hadn't realized his inclinations had run quite that deep. Or perhaps they'd only started moving in that direction in the 5 years Dantes had been in the pit. Dantes started to go through the rest of the letters, finding that most of them were from Mistress Doja. They were all some mix of demeaning, degrading, and disgusting, but Dantes didn't judge that so much as the occasional reminders that Danglars owed her money. It was important to pay a whore what they were owed. Knowing how much time Danglars spent with her was also useful, so he filed that information away in his mind for later. Toward the bottom of the secret drawer was a letter that had clearly been crumpled and uncrumpled more than once. He took it and ran the flat of his palm across it to remove enough of the creases to make the paper legible. Danglars Forteville, son of Cornelia of the house of Forteville, a founding house of Rendhold. This is my 5th letter to you. While the first receiving no response, I can blame on the incompetence of the airhead staff you keep, the other 3 I cannot. You will not ignore me. Everything you have in this life is thanks to me. The home in which you were raised, the name on the back of which you became a magister, and even your very life itself. I ensure that you were raised in the manner of a lord. You received the finest training in etiquette. You were taught elvish, Orcish, and even the old tongue of the fatherland. I had the servant discipline you only when you were truly deserving, and attended you myself thrice a day at meal times, far more than most mothers of my station. I even nursed you in my own breast when your father's incompetence cost us the money we needed to afford a nursemaid, though it did cause me great pain and discomfort. Even when you decided to risk what little we have to play thief in Midtown with those disgusting mutts, I held back the majority of my criticisms and used what connections I could to keep you from trouble. Now, when my lessons in parenting have finally sunk in and you have become a true man in high society, I am ignored. Our house is in ruins, and you will not send money for me to have the servants and lifestyle to which I am accustomed. You will not allow me to move into your new home, though it holds more than enough rooms in which to place me and whatever servants I deserve. You are killing me, son. You are killing your mother, just as your father did when he invested in that shipment of ginseng. I cough blood into a handkerchief, and each day I grow weaker in this drafty manner filled with regrets, the largest of which is you. I am done expecting you to act as a son should. When I die, I will haunt you. You are a pig and a scoundrel, and you will someday die as one. From the Honorable Madame Cornelia of the house of Forteville, a founding house of Rendhold at it novel Benedat. Dantes finished reading, finding his eyebrows were raised even higher than they had been when reading the letters from Doja. Danglars had mentioned an overbearing mother many times and an idiot father, but there was a large difference between hearing a friend speak between cups and reading a letter from the man's mother. Dantes couldn't really relate. To the idiot father, certainly, but for his mother he had nothing but affection. He frowned. There could be something useful there too, but he wasn't sure what. Still, just to disconcert Danglars, he slipped the letter into his jacket. He looked through the drawer one more time and found a final letter. This one had a metallic scent to it and was written in a kind of golden ink. There was no content to it aside from a list of what Dantes guessed were meetings or laws. Next to each of them was either a Y and N or an A. At the very bottom of the letter was beautifully written G, likely to indicate who had sent it. Dantes pocketed that one as well. He patted the pocket where he'd placed Danglars' symbol of office, an idea forming in his mind. It was late at night, but morning would come soon. It would certainly be interesting for him to call on some of the boats smuggling goods into the city as their crews began to wake, wouldn't it? Dantes made it to the docks with time to spare and began sending out rats and roaches to search all of the nearby vessels that had just come into port. As he did that, he slipped into the dock manager's office with Jacopo. It was early, and so there was only a skeleton crew napping on some cots. Inside, he found a long gray jacket that docking officials that worked for the city wore. He found one that fit him without much issue and slipped it on. He adjusted his posture, straightening his back a bit, and shaped the branch around his left forearm into the shape of one of the clubs often worn at the dockworker's side. He strolled out of the front door and began walking down the docks to his first target, a medium-sized Frasciid ship lazily bouncing with the waves. Inside, beneath the shipment of cotton and silk that the city was expecting, was a large amount of weed and dust that Dantes presumed was meant for Mondego's storehouse. He brought 2 fingers to his lips and whistled loudly, scattering a number of gulls that were gathered nearby, who he muttered a quick apology to. A man wearing a white cotton shirt peeked over the side of the boat at Dantes, his eyes bleary and a small beer stain on the front of his shirt. Dantes pointed his club at the man taking initiative. "You, give me your captain. Now." The man shook his head and stumbled over to his slave, smacking him on the face and pointing at the entrance to their below decks. The slave scurried away, and the man stumbled back to Dantes, rubbing his eyes and trying to wake himself more fully. "I believe we already paid the docking fee, sir," he said. "Not about that fee." Another man appeared, this one more awake and wearing a tricord hat on his head and a saber at his waist. "I'm the captain of this vessel. What is it the docking authority needs?" Dantes smiled and pulled Danglars' symbol of office from his jacket. "The local magister who maintains the legal organization of this portion of the docks requires an additional fee before you may bring your goods onto land." The captain frowned deeply and walked quickly off the boat, eyeing the symbol of office. "We don't pay a fee. We're the ones who are paid." Dantes shrugged. "All I know is that my boss told me to come down here and get 10 gold from you, unless you wanted to round up some of the dock guards and have them take a closer look at your inventory than they did the first time." The man's face reddened. "That's outrageous." Dantes nodded. "All right, the guards it is. If I were you, I wouldn't be so keen to be arrested in a foreign city. I mean, we're a bit better to our prisoners here than you are to your slaves, but not by much." The captain gritted his teeth before looking back up to where a sailor was standing. "Don't just gawk. Go get him the damned gold." Dantes waited until the pouch was in his hand, and he nodded at the captain. "Expect the same price next time. Mondego's people will be here to collect the goods later." The captain seemed too angry to respond, and simply walked back onto his boat, cursing under his breath. Dantes moved down the docks to the next boat, this one from Vicent, where one of their smaller steam cargo ships was docked. Unlike the Frasciid boat, this one had a halfling standing on the prow, keeping watch, and a scattering of gnomes, and even a dwarf beginning work on cleaning the deck and doing various tasks. The halfling looked at him and immediately signaled silently to a younger halfling on deck who disappeared only to swiftly return with a gnome wearing a black uniform with 2 silver pips on the collar. If you encounter this story on Amazon, note that it's taken without permission from the author. Report it. "What is it that the docking authority needs from us?" he asked, offering his hand to shake. Dantes took his hand and returned it firmly. This time Dantes didn't beat around the bush. A bribe. The man nodded. Why and how much? The magister, who is a part of the smuggling operation here, wants a larger cut of the profits. Dantes flashed Dangler's symbol. He is requesting 10 gold. Otherwise, I summon the guard who will discover the gunpowder that you have hidden on board. The man nodded. Not a good idea. This will cause Danglars a lot of trouble going forward. Dantes nodded, doing his best to appear pained about it. Good man. Following orders you disagree with. It's my duty, sir. The gnome gestured to one of his men, who vanished briefly and returned with a small pouch. The gnome handed it to Dantes, who took it. We will be lodging a complaint with Mondego. Dantes nodded. As is your duty, sir. The gnome gave a small smile and walked back onto his boat. The next ship was a Dracious vessel, manned entirely by orcs and half-orcs wearing the heavy patterned wool sweaters that marked their clans. Dantes had been on Dracious vessels often since he was a child. His father served on one of their ships, after all. He didn't see anyone he recognized, so raised up a hand at the third mate that was peering over the railing. "You half-blood, what do you want?" Dantes twirled his club in his hand. "Your captain now, then maybe your sister later." "My sister would break you in half." Dantes shrugged. "Your mother, then. She'd break you to quarters. Bring me your captain, or I'll bring the guard." The mate threw up his hands. Fine. He disappeared and came back with a larger green-skinned orc wearing the customary sweater along with a thick bandana and sporting heavy tattoos on his face. "What do you want?" 10 gold. "What for?" "To keep me from calling the guard and having them find all that dust you've got on board." The captain leapt off the boat and landed heavily on the dock in front of Dantes, stepping toward him. Dantes didn't step back or give any ground, but he did subtly change his club to make it spiked with curved thorns. "You threatening me, boy?" asked the orc, baring his tusks. "I'm not." He held up Dangler's symbol. "The magister I serve is. Kill me, and I'll just be replaced. Not to mention the guard coming for you." The orc shook his head with a disgusted look on his face. "I hate doing shipments here. It's always some new kind of horseshit. Bunch of clanless half-blood with no honor, or elves. This whole city is a cesspit." Dantes shrugged. "Well, at least I rank higher than elves." The captain spat at Dantes' feet. "No, bureaucrats are worse than elves. Corrupt bureaucrats in particular." Dantes was tempted to point out the hypocrisy, considering the man was smuggling in drugs to a city by a means that was only available to him because of corruption, and likely doing so to line his own pockets. But he decided that wasn't prudent. The orc captain looked up to his third mate. "Get him his damned gold. I don't want to talk to this slime anymore." He moved back onto his boat, and shortly after the third mate tossed down 10 gold in coppers, nearly knocking Dantes off his feet as he caught it. Dantes directed the rats on the ship to shit in their grog, and continued on his way down the dock. He hit a half-dozen more ships, always sure to show Dangler's symbol of office, and doing his best to be a perfect mix of convincing enough to get the gold, and a pain in the ass enough that Mondego would hear about it. By the end of it, he made a tidy sum on top of sowing a fair amount of discord. He began to move toward a final target, a Visalian ship moving arcane books of some kind, when a guard on patrol squinted at him. He attempted to keep walking, trying to let a confident stride do the talking for him, but the guard continued looking at him, even starting to move toward him. "Hey," yelled the guard, just loud enough to carry over the noise of the docks. Dantes kept walking. "Stop! At it novel Bennett at." Dantes started running, his backpack jingling from the coins he had. He quickly ducked into a nearby alley and shifted into rat form, sitting next to a pile of refuse when the guard entered it. He did a sweep of it, rubbed his eyes, and then exited the alley, still looking both ways as if searching for him. Dantes stayed in rat form and made his way further away before returning to his usual self. He found himself panting heavily when he was done transforming. He leaned against a wall, sweat dripping from his forehead. Something was wrong. He hadn't been in rat form long enough to feel so poorly. He stumbled into an alley and wretched. Jacopo, he sent, but Jacopo didn't respond. When he focused, he could sense that he was also suffering. Curled somewhere cramped with a recently empty stomach and shivering, Dantes began to move toward where he sensed him each step growing more painful as his vision began to blur. He wasn't sure how he made it back to his garden with Jacopo, but he did. He shivered but felt hot. He retched, but had nothing left to come up. He curled himself into a ball on the dirt a half-dozen feet from his bedroll and lost consciousness. He stood in darkness, still in tremendous pain, even though he was dreaming. He heard movement and turned just in time to see a flash of someone and feel the sting of cut flesh deep into his side. He heard movement again, and again saw only a flash of movement followed by pain. It happened a third time, and he attempted to reach for whoever was striking him, but they avoided his grasp. He reached out his branches and vines, thick with blood-red leaves, toward the source of the pain, but felt his connection to them quickly sever as they were diced by a long spear tip. The intruder was getting closer and closer to his heart, the center from which he spread. When the intruder had first attacked, he'd thought it was a dozen men at once. He'd been able to spread so quickly, so beautifully, since they had stopped attempting to halt him. He nearly reached the center, where his brother was able to spread high into the sky and reach toward the sunlight. He felt that his brother was under attack as well, though, his mighty trunk being cut deeply as he bled ichor down to the ground. He redoubled his efforts, sending branch after branch at the man, but the man moved too quickly, dodging with a speed far beyond anything he had encountered before. He struck with his spear, jumped off of the wall of the cavern, leaving craters behind. He pushed off with so much force. Worst of all was the man's laughter. He was enjoying the fight. That disgusted the garden. He wanted the man to tremble in fear, to run in terror, so that he could pierce his back and drink deeply of his blood. Dantes regained consciousness and found himself divided between his own perceptions and those of his old garden in the Underprison. He tried to focus, to determine more clearly what was happening. The garden fought for its life against a single man. He was familiar, though he could only sense the man and not see him due to the garden's different senses. He clutched his heart. It was beating so quickly he thought it might burst from his chest. He looked to Jacopo, who was curled next to him, struggling to stay alive and conscious as well. Added novel Benedat. The garden had grown, had become something different and uncontrollable, just as the other druids had warned him it would. He thought he'd have more time, but he'd struggled to find consortium contacts since the most recent prison break. They'd gone underground, and so he'd had no way to know what was happening. Even when he'd attempted to follow the thick thread that connected him to the garden so that he could get a better picture of what was happening, it had been as if he was blocked from it somehow. His connection at that moment seemed to be only possible due to the distress the garden was experiencing, which was amplifying his connection to it. As he struggled to connect all these threads in his mind, the edges of his vision darkened, and he lost consciousness again. The man had made it through to the heart of the garden. He had sliced through a wall of vines, thorns, and would to get there, barely being slowed down by any of it. The garden felt exposed, its beating heart blood red and beating against the far wall of the chamber in which it was born. It kept sending more and more at the warrior in an attempt to slow him down, and as it did so, 3 chambers on the heart slid open. From within it, 3 tall, lean figures emerged. They were covered in bark, and their eye sockets sat empty, but they looked at the man nonetheless. One of them raised its arm and formed a long dagger-like thorn. The other did the same to create a sword, and the third stood there behind them, weaponless, but began to move its arms in a wide, sweeping motion, and thorns began to rise everywhere around it and fire at the spearmen. The story has been taken without consent. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. The spearman dodged and parried every thorn, launching himself at the 2 armed creatures that attacked him. He drove his spear tip into the heart of the one with the dagger, but it simply grabbed the haft of the spear and attempted to pull him closer as the other one took a swing at his legs. The spearman stomped on the edge of the blade, coming for his feet, ceasing its movement, and leaned into the one that pulled him in and twisted his spear, muttering words under his breath. The tip of his spear began to glow white-hot, and the creature let out a terrible scream as the bark that was its skin caught fire and began to blacken. The other creature released its blade and formed 2 new ones, but the spearman simply cut through both of them, and the creature's chest in one smooth motion. The last one raised a four-fingered hand and launched a never-ending salvo of small thorns at the man, who began running in a weaving pattern to avoid it. Before the spearman reached it, it looked away, and somehow Dantes felt the void where its eyes stared at him. He regained consciousness and brought his full attention to the blood-red thread that connected him to his own garden. He grasped it in his mind and tried to pull it out of himself, but found that it wouldn't break. He hacked at it with his will, but made only nicks in the thick root of the thing. Finally, he began to cut it more gradually, as if sawing through it inch by inch. It was agonizing, as if he was sawing off his own arm, but in his split focus he could see the spearman reach the garden's heart, and he knew instinctively what would happen if he pierced it. He doubled his efforts, hearing a roar that he didn't even realize was his own as he saw it. The spearman lunged for the heart, his white-hot spear in front of him. Dantes finished cutting the connection, feeling the last fiber of it sever, as if it was a nerve, and he collapsed, not sure if it was death or sleep that was coming for him as his eyes closed. There was blackness for some time, the relief of absolute oblivion. Then Dantes found himself floating above a familiar table, with a scale sitting in the center of it. He looked to his shoulder and was relieved to see Jacopo there with him. They both turned their attention to the table. The green woman and the man in blue were each taking coins off the scale and placing them to the side of it. They removed each coin simultaneously, and the scale itself never shifted even a hair until it was completely emptied. At that moment, it disappeared. The coins they placed down were then picked up by someone new, a woman wearing a black veil that hid her face and an elegant black and white dress. Her hands were gloved, but clearly delicate. She would take each coin and slowly work it in a thread, which she then extended further and further. Once she was done creating a long golden thread, the man in blue and the woman in green each took an end of it and threaded a needle through it. The green woman's needle was more like a thorn, and the blue man's needle was steel. They approached the table again. The woman picked up the rat that she'd been petting and drove the needle through him, though he didn't even flinch as she did so. Then she moved on to the roaches, then a large bat that was clinging to a branch extending from her shoulder. The man in blue began to produce objects from his blue cloak, even Dantes' trained eye unable to determine where they came from. Dice, a deck of cards, a fine piece of silk, he wove the thread through all of it, calmly and expertly. The woman in the veil let the thread slowly unspool. There was a warmth to the woman that made Dantes feel oddly comforted. He looked around more and saw that the man with the cruel smile was still sitting in a corner, watching the proceedings, his eyes on a large pile of gold thread. He tried to look closer at the scene, to make sense of everything that was happening, but his vision blurred and the dream vanished to nothingness. Dantes woke up to the feeling of the sun beating down on him in the high heat of mid-afternoon. He squinted, slowly pulling himself up. His mouth was dry and tasted of bile. He dragged himself to his bedroll and grabbed his water skin. He swished a mouthful of water around in his mouth and spat it out at a nearby vine, complaining of thirst. He then took several small sips. Jacopo dragged himself over to him, and Dantes poured some of the water into the palm of his hand and held it to him so that he could drink as well. They both sat there in silence for some time, listening to the sleep-talking of the bats nearby and the gossip of some pigeons that sat perched above them. They were both exhausted and heavily weakened by their experience. Dantes could feel that he'd lost something of himself when he'd severed his connection to his old garden. He looked at the threads that spread out from him, finding that the rest of the connections he'd forged were still in place. The gardens he'd planted, the vermin he'd fed, the flowers he'd helped bloom, all of them still had rivers that flowed to and from him in almost equal measure. He clenched and unclenched his fist, checking his strength as he wondered what would have happened had he had only the one garden when it was destroyed. Had it novel been at? He began to reach out his senses, sending rats to check on the vixen. It was still being monitored, but Vampa was there, and the girls and Vera seemed safe and busy. He let out a sigh of relief. That relief quickly turned to concern as his mind began to consider everything that had happened. His garden had gone mad and been attacking people. He could sense the blood of dozens flowing through it when he had been connected to it fully. Had that been what had caused the second breakout? If so, had they connected at all to Dantes? Those he'd been looking for as friends to help could well be enemies now, and he couldn't blame them. He'd been searching for any Collard or anyone else he'd recognize, but Rendhold was a big city, and even with his abilities, if he didn't have a good idea of where to start search, then he might never find anyone. The majority of prisoners probably fled for the walls or tried to sign up onto a ship. It wasn't like the guards could watch every exit. He forced himself to stand. Keeping all of these plates spinning wasn't going to get any easier if he took the time to rest. He moved over to the small bowl and mirror he used for cleaning. He stared into the mirror for a long time. He was astonished at how different he looked. He'd felt weaker, he'd expected to, but in the mirror he almost didn't recognize himself. His eyes were more deeply sunken, his cheeks hollow, his muscles had deteriorated, and his clothes seemed to hang off of him. It was as if the vitality had been sucked from his body. He looked worse than he had in the underprison before he'd gained his powers. He poured water into his bowl and cupped it in his hands, about to clean his face, when he hesitated. He looked different. He looked pathetic and weak and in dire need of help. He thought of the man who had torn through his garden with his spear, the same man he'd seen fight in the Adventurers Guild arena. He seemed like the kind of guy who'd want to help a man like the one Dantes seemed to be at that moment. Jacopo slowly made his way over to him, sensing his thoughts. He was strong. It's quite possible he could do it and not die. Dantes smiled. Even if he lives, we'd still benefit. Seems like a win-win. Jacopo cleaned his whiskers. I shall hope for his death. If you encounter this story on Amazon, note that it's taken without permission from the author. Report it. Dantes walked through the guild district with a limp, still reeking of vomit and bile. He'd exchanged his nice green coat for a well-worn brown one with some suspicious red stains. Getting there had taken some time, as he found himself winded far more easily than he had been before. Still, he persevered, already sensing a bit of his strength starting to return as his gardens began to nourish and restore him. It wasn't hard to locate Gawain. He was eating at a pub near the Adventurers Guild, and a small crowd was gathered outside and gossiping about him. The streets were positively buzzing from his successful slaying of the Crimson Garden, as the bards were already calling it. Dantes was also sad to see that the Mother's Reach he'd planted was nearly gone, being cute meter by specialist mages sent from the Academy. Apparently, there had been a long delay to their involvement, as they did their best to extort additional payment and privilege from the city in order to do it. Dantes reached the edge of the small crowd and took note of all of the watchers outside of the building. There were 2 at each door, keeping anyone from getting in to speak to Gawain. From what Dantes could tell, Gawain himself seemed ignorant of that arrangement. A slick handler wearing a silver adventurer's pin and a black coat chainmail stood near him, managing him and his escort expertly. Dantes waited outside. It wouldn't be that difficult for him to sneak in and approach the man when he was eating, but it would be easier to do so once he was out on the street. He leaned against a wall in a nearby alley and did his best imitation of a beggar. That made him nearly invisible. Gawain finished his meal, and his handlers cleared the nearby area of gawkers before he exited the pub and began moving down the street. Dantes followed behind them for a time, eavesdropping. I think it would be good to see more of the city, said Gawain to his primary handler wearing the silver wolf pin. You were only called here to help the city deal with the Crimson Garden. Otherwise, you would have been sent on another dragon hunt right away. There are few others who can hunt them as you do, and the longer you're away, the more likely some poor family is going to be burnt to a crisp. Gawain sighed. I suppose you're right. Seeing more will have to wait. Dantes moved a half-dozen roaches onto the feet of some handlers, distracting them as he slipped by and began approaching Gawain. The man in the black coat appeared in front of him, quick as lightning, and struck him hard in the gut before he could react, his gloved fist hitting Dantes with the weight of a brick. What are you doing? Asked Gawain. The man was approaching you quickly, and he has a dagger at his waist. Everyone has a weapon here. Gawain pushed past the man and helped Dantes to his feet. Say, are you okay? Dantes suppressed a smile. The punch to the gut had been a surprise, but it looked like it was going to help him in the long run. He looked up with his most miserable expression, something between a kicked puppy and a dying orphan. "No, my lord. I came here to ask for your help." "My help?" The man in black moved toward him. "If he needs something, he'll need to petition the guild. He isn't your problem." Gawain ignored him. "What is it you need?" The man in black let out an exasperated sigh. "My wife and children, sire. They've been taken. I think they're going to be sold to Frashiad as slaves." Gawain's eyes hardened at the mention of slavery. "Have you contacted the guard?" "Aye, sir, and they beat me for my efforts." "I'd expected that, but I had nowhere else to turn." "Where are they?" "Gawain, you can't really be considering helping him? You're an adventurer. This isn't your business. Now that the Underprison is cleared, you need to be back to questing. This city doesn't need help like those smaller towns and villages do. They can handle themselves." That made good sense to Dantes. Most of the business the guild got was because so many frontier towns and settlements couldn't get support from their rulers. He just hoped that Gawain didn't care. "The god of justice put this man in my path for a reason. I must help him. You can't get involved in things like this. It's too messy. Use your he." Gawain surprised Dantes by grabbing him and throwing him over his shoulder before leaping over one of the handlers and running down the street. "Tell me where to go." Dantes shook his head, his eyes seeming to bounce at the sudden and rapid movement. "Toward the docks, my lord. They have them caged in a warehouse." "Yeah, I'm going to need step-by-step directions. Cities confuse me. Take a left up ahead, my lord." Gawain ran at a very impressive clip to the docks. Even with Dantes taking him along mainly back roads and alleys, they still reached the warehouse within the hour. Dantes' dignity was a bit bruised by being carried the whole way, but in his withered state, it definitely made things easier. Besides, Jacopo didn't mind getting carried around all day. Dantes just needed to borrow his attitude a bit. Dantes returned his focus to the rat he'd placed in the rafters of the warehouse earlier in the day. Things were active inside, and it looked like a massive new shipment had just been dropped off for processing. Gawain placed Dantes back on the ground and raised his spear, taking a deep inhale and looking over the rough guards walking into and out of the building. "This is the place?" he asked. Dantes nodded emphatically. "Yes, sir. This is where they're holding my wife and child. Many others as well." Gawain nodded and looked at the warehouse. I suppose if I'm wrong, I can always pay for the broken glass." "What?" asked Dantes. Gawain didn't answer, instead launching himself upward and toward the windows near the top of the building. There was the sound of shattering glass and a heavy thud. Dantes shifted his focus to the rat he had inside and moved where he believed he'd be able to avoid any stray bullets or spells and crouched down. He'd sent the rat other than Jacopo inside for the same reason he'd just hidden. No reason to put himself or his companion at risk. Gawain stood on a table, alone, his spear in his hand, looking around at the flabbergasted gangsters, illicit goods covering the tables, and finally, he caught a glimpse of the edge of a cage at the far end of the warehouse. He raised his spear and pointed at the nearest confused man who was still holding a crate. "Surrender, and none of you will come to harm." The man in front of him threw the crate at his head, and then chaos erupted. Gawain smashed the crate with his spear, scattering the bags of dust inside and creating a cloud of white powder. He leapt down, smashing the man's collarbone with the shaft of his spear as he landed. He threw himself back as another man moved to tackle him and smashed the butt of his spear into a third man that was approaching. He kicked a crate on the ground into one of them, smashing it into his head and knocking him to the ground. Gawain dove forward into more approaching guards, smashing his spear left and right. Even from where Dantes sat outside, he could hear the loud thwacks of Gawain's spear ringing out like thunder, breaking bones and knocking guards left and right. A gunshot rang out, sending splinters from a barrel next to Gawain into the air. Gawain began running toward the gunman, who stood next to two other men wielding pistols. Gawain moved fluidly in a snake-like formation as the other two men fired, avoiding both of their shots. He leapt 10 feet into the air to where they stood and drove his spear tip through the hand of the first shooter who was moving to reload, then kicked the other two from their position with a powerful sweep of his leg before smashing his head into that of the other man. As Gawain was tearing his way through the guards and braver workers, the rest of the warehouse began to flee. The men that had been sorting goods bolted for the door, and the naked women that had been packaging dust fled, all of them being peppered by debris and splinters from the battle Gawain was having. Dantes watched through the rat's eyes with keen interest. It was all going very well. He'd prefer that the lower-level people all got out, but he hoped that those more deeply entrenched within Mondiego's operation would be more defensive of their holdings. He had sent word to Pasha, through a note he and Jacopok left on his desk, that there would be trouble at the warehouse and to bring men. He checked the rat he had tracking him and saw that Pasha had managed to get nearly 20 men together, and they'd be reaching the warehouse soon. Dantes would have to get some distance to make sure he didn't get caught up in anything. He'd have to enjoy the successful dismantling of part of Mondiego's operation from a distance. A shame, but a necessary one. He started to move when something that the rat in the ramparts saw caught his eye. By the slave cells, he saw the silver glint of a familiar long elvish blade. He moved the rat closer and saw, crouched by one of the cells, Jason, Jake, and Zach. "Fuck," said Dantes out loud. "At it novel been at." "The shadow cats," said Jacopo. Dantes quickly considered several things. They were working for Mondego, or at least for one of his captains. They might know more about what had happened in the prison. If he revealed himself to them, he'd be putting himself in danger. "Fuck it," he said as he began to move toward the warehouse rather than away from it. Gawain was still fighting, smashing a man with the butt of his spear with enough force to crack his sternum, and then leaping toward a man shooting off blasts of force from his hands. Dantes reached the backside of the warehouse where the shadow cats were huddled and quickly climbed up to where the window was, his weakened body screaming at him as he did so. Jacopo climbed up his arm and unlatched the window. Then Dantes pushed it open, barely managing to pull himself up high enough up to see inside. Jason was the closest to him, having a quiet argument with the others that seemed to be a debate between fleeing, fighting, and hiding. "Jason," Dantes yelled. "Stolen story. Please report." Jason looked around as if unable to tell where the voice was coming from. "Jason," he yelled again. Jason saw him, and his eyes widened. "Dantes, grab this," he said, willing the branch on his arm to extend down the window and hang loose like rope as he let himself slide back down to the ground. The branch was thin, but when he felt the weight of one of the shadow cats on the other side of it, he started to worry less about it breaking and more about himself breaking. He gritted his teeth and held on as Jake dropped from the other side, landing next to him and grabbing part of the branch. Zach followed behind, with Jason being last. "Dantes, what are you doing here?" asked Jason. "I'm guessing the attack was his doing," responded Jake. Dantes flicked his focus across everything he was tracking. Gawain was on his last guard, and Pasha would be there in moments. "I don't have time for this, just as you three don't have time to tell me why you're working for Mondego. We need to move." Dantes listened to his own command and started running, not bothering to look back to see if they were following. In his deteriorated state, they quickly caught up to him, and he started to hear heavy guardsmen boots getting closer to them as Pasha ordered his men to sweep the area. He started to slow down, and Zach looked back, moving to help him. "No, go ahead. I'll distract them. You all keep running." Zach hesitated. "Go damn it. And for the love of everything, I'd better hear a better name than Shadow Cats when I see you next." Zach nodded and started running again. The moment he was out of sight, Dantes became a rat and scurried behind some refused to hide and rest, feeling just as tired in rat form as he had as himself. Jacopo breathed heavily next to him as they hid. Dantes returned his focus to the warehouse, sending rats and roaches to follow Zach as he did so. Gawain stood, not even panting, in the center of an absolutely destroyed warehouse. Guards groaning or bleeding were all around him, but Dantes saw only 2 or 3 that seemed to be dead. Crates and barrels had been smashed, and there was still a fine mist of dust scattered through the air. Gawain did an unnecessary flip off of the table he'd been standing on and landed closer to the cages. He looked over them, seeing frightened, but otherwise unharmed men, women, and children. He raised the spear and smashed the lock to a cage in which a solitary woman had been kept. "It's okay. You're free now. I've come to rescue you." "Rescue me?" asked the woman. He held out a hand and puffed out his chest. "Yes, I am Gawain of the Adventurers Guild, and I've come to free you and put an end to this dastardly enterprise." "Please leave," said the woman, moving to close the gate. Gawain's expression went from smiling and heroic to confused. "What? I sold myself into slavery. Need to keep my parents fed. They can't work anymore, and told me they'd care for my son. If I disappear now, it won't be long before someone's knocking on our door for their money back." "That's horrible," said Gawain. Dantes, still panting as a rat, was amazed at the man's naivete, but he supposed it had worked to his benefit, so he wasn't going to complain. I was sold because I owe gambling debt," said a man, raising his hand from another cage. "If you could let me out, I'd appreciate it." "Okay," said Gawain, moving to that cage and breaking the lock, then moving on to the others, though several refused to move, as the first woman did. Most of them were clearly grateful to have been saved. He looked at an ugly woman with a gray mud of a child as he let them out. "Your husband is waiting outside. He's who sent me to save you." The woman's eyes widened. "My husband's been dead for 3 years." Gawain raised his eyebrows. "Wait, what?" Dante stifled the little bit of indignation he'd felt at the assumption that woman was his wife. Even sickly as he was at the moment, he could certainly do better than that. Just as the first man that was freed was making his way to the main entry, the guard busted in, trampling him underfoot as they made their way inside and swept the area, armored and wielding metal clubs. Pasha moved in after the rest of them, his own faceplate open as he surveyed everything, a mixed look of surprise and satisfaction on his face as he observed the various obvious contraband and recognized a number of criminals he'd encountered in the past scattered throughout the floor moaning in pain. Gawain approached him and gave a bow. "Welcome, guards. I took care of this den of evil and sin for you. No need for thank you. Justice is its own reward." Pasha took a step toward him. "You're the adventurer, Gawain, right?" "That I am. You're under arrest for vigilantism and overstepping the authority of the Adventurers Guild." Gawain's expression dropped for a third time, this time not recovering. "What?" Dantes watched as Gawain allowed himself to be arrested and Pasha and his men tore through the warehouse. Part of him was sad to see so many valuable goods that were bound to be pocketed, destroyed, or in the case of dust, inhaled, but it wasn't his loss, it was Mondiego's, and that put a smile on his face. He checked where the shadow cats had gone, finding that they were on their way deep into Midtown, where he wouldn't be able to follow. Still, he was gratified that they didn't seem to be headed straight to Mondego. Once Dantes and Jacopo were feeling strong enough, they began making their way out of the docks and back toward their garden. They needed to take frequent breaks, but things sped up once Dantes was able to become human again and walk the rest of the way. When he reached it, he was exhausted. His strength had been returning through his connections, but he had expended more energy that he was regaining, and the deficit had grown too large. He collapsed onto his bedroll, forcing himself to stay awake just long enough to force down a small meal with Jacopo, and willed several rats and roaches to keep watch before he passed out entirely. Dantes found himself floating above the table he'd now grown extremely familiar with. The table that held the scale now seemed to hold a massive tapestry full of patterns and images, many of which he couldn't fully see in the dreamlike haze that seemed to obscure everything. The woman in green was deftly weaving golden thread through a corner of it, and Dante saw that the rat, roach, and bat were now represented by massive and intricate patterns of thread within the tapestry, all over a background of lush green. He could see feathers in what the woman was sewing, but couldn't distinguish anything beyond that. He also noticed a red corner on her section that, unlike the rest of it, seemed well worn, the red of it fading near to a rusty brown. The man in blue was sewing as well. His side of the tapestry was of a distinctly dark blue that matched his cloak. The images he sewed seemed to pop far more for the contrast, with piles of gold, sultry-looking women, and men of dubious character all starting to take shape on his side. Dantes thought he recognized a few of the faces, but he couldn't quite connect them to reality. Dantes also noticed that the spool of thread wasn't shrinking as the blue, cloaked man sewed. He followed the thread he was holding and realized that it was connected to the cloak of the man in black, who was deep in conversation with a veiled woman a few meters from the table, seemingly unaware of the slowly unwinding gold thread being taken from his cloak. As Dantes was looking over everything, he suddenly felt a chill on his neck and a tightness in his chest. Those physical sensations contrasted sharply with the dreamlike nature of everything else, and he found himself scanning the horizon and searching for its source. In the far distance, he saw a black figure that he couldn't distinguish. There was a glint of metal and sunlight coming from him, and Dantes felt almost blinded by that reflection, even with the great distance between them. In spite of that, he pushed himself to try and make out any more detail. One thing he could make out, though, was that the glint of a headsman's axe. Dantes spent the next 2 days recovering. He focused on improving and expanding his gardens, talking to the local flora and fauna, and monitoring the reactions to the sacking of Mondeggo's storehouse. The guard was furious, with both Gavain and Pasha. The Adventurers Guild struck some kind of deal to have Gavain released, and he was promptly sent on a quest in Viscent to explore some kind of magical maze that had sprouted up in that region. Pasha was privately reprimanded by his superiors for every single choice he made. They were furious that he'd done the raid, though they were impressed that he'd arrested Gavain. Publicly, most people were furious that Gavain was arrested for doing what the guard should have been doing. In general, Dantes felt that everything had gone very well considering what limited resources he'd been working with. In spite of his overall positive feelings, one day while he slept he found himself stricken with strange and inhuman dreams in which he lived an entire short and miserable life. He was hatched from an egg, and from that moment on he never stopped moving. He had to be quicker than his brothers and sisters to reach food before they did, but not so quick that something larger than himself found him first and ate him. He scuttled between small cracks in doors and walls, climbed up drain pipes, shook himself free of spiders' webs, and avoided the massive feet of those creatures which seemed to extend into the sky above him. He never questioned his lot. He never felt fear in the same way he had before. He simply moved and lived and struggled, siring thousands of children of his own, crunching vile refuse between his mandibles. All that existed was the moment he was in, and in times of great success, the next few seconds afterward. Dantes awoke from his uneasy dreams to find himself halfway transformed into a hideous insect. His limbs were splitting along the middle to form additional appendages, his teeth merging and protruding from his mouth, and his eyebrow ridges flattening back as his eyes widened and darkened into pitch-black pools. He let out a noise somewhere between a scream and a screech as his body slowly compressed down into the size of a copper piece. He had an awareness of what was happening. His roach mark had filled while he was sleeping, and just as had happened when he'd filled the rat mark, he was gaining a new form. Being aware of what was happening, however, did not make the experience any less painful or horrifying. After several agonizing minutes, he had fully become a roach, his antennae twitching and the hairs on his legs picking up movements nearby. Jacopo stood over him, regarding him with a twitch of his whiskers. Dantes felt distinctly uncomfortable seeing and sensing him from this perspective. He much preferred being the larger of them. I'll need a coat to carry you in." Dantes laughed, which manifested as a clicking of mandibles, and then forced himself to become human again. The process was just as horrifying in the opposite direction. His antennae shrank back into his skull. His non-functional wings slowly slid back into his body as his spine reformed, and he could feel the reorganizing of his internal organs back into their original places. He found himself panting on all fours and brought his arm up to look at his roach mark. It was filled in completely with gold now, and in spite of the pain he'd just experienced, Dantes made a brief thank you to the roach god for his blessing. That was a fantastic first joke. Jacopo nodded with the assurance of someone with absolute confidence, and no hint that they were surprised at the compliment. Dantes gritted his teeth and began the transformation again. This time it was quicker, and the pain diminished. He repeated the process several more times, each time better understanding a portion of the changes he was experiencing and going through them with greater ease. Eventually, he was making the change almost as quickly as he became a rat. If you find this story on Amazon, be aware that it has been stolen. Please report the infringement. Jacopo watched all this unfold while nibbling on the core of an apple. That seems painful. It is. Will becoming a roach truly be useful? You can already become the greatest of creatures. What can a roach do that a rat can't? Fit in smaller places, survive great falls, sense vibrations in the air, walk up completely flat and vertical surfaces. No fur, though. An unfortunate type of creature. Even two legs are blessed with some. Fur. Dantes had the image of a roach covered in fur briefly enter his mind and shuddered a bit. I think it's better that they are as they are. Jacopo shrugged and returned his attention to his apple. Dantes flexed his hands and swept his hand through his overgrown hair to subtly make sure that there were no longer antennae sticking out his forehead. He cleaned himself with some fresh water, soap, and a damp cloth before getting dressed and sliding on his green jacket. As he moved, he realized he could feel changes around him. Subtle movements of the bats nearby, the pigeons shuffling along a nearby rooftop, and the footsteps of a cat moving just outside the garden, likely sensing the potential prey within it. Just as becoming a rat had granted him a greater understanding of where paths were underground, becoming a roach seemed to have imbued him with some additional abilities even outside of roach form. Dantes let Jacopo leap up and onto his jacket, then climbed out of his garden, landing in an alley across from an old gray tabby cat that was busily licking his crotch. At Novel Benedat. "Morning," said Dantes as he pulled up his hood. The cat looked up at him, but left his leg in the air. He regarded him for a moment, then returned to what he was doing. Dantes' experiences with cats had been mixed so far. Many simply ignored him, others made immediate demands, and one of them called him a nutless invalid. It would likely take a fair amount of time before he was able to meet the cat god. Dantes moved south, away from Midtown and the docks, and toward the southern gate. The streets were active, and it took him some time to tune out all of the extrasensory information he was receiving. He didn't need to worry too much about hiding his identity. Most of those who were out and about were working or moving goods into the city, too busy to pay him any attention, and largely not locals. Still, he kept his hood up and stayed wary. He walked through the gate with no trouble, the few guards there not paying attention to anything leaving the inner part of the city so much as what was moving into it. He saw a few horse-drawn carts and sent the beasts of burden hello. The area outside the inner city was largely the same as the one within it, only changing gradually as one got further away. The tall buildings and warehouses started to give way to smaller buildings made less of cement and brick and more of wood, or in some particularly unfortunate cases, wattle and daub. There were fewer mutts and more kobolds, dwarves, and halflings in this part of the city. The old blood of Rendhold was largely elves, humans, orcs, and gnomes with a few exceptions here and there, but in the outer city things were more varied. He saw a number of gatemen, those gangsters that controlled the smuggling flowing into the city from the southwestern gate. Dantes had never really spent much time in the outer city. He preferred the heavy impact of cobblestone and concrete against his boots to the muddy paths further out. There was also less opportunity out there, for the most part. Most of the people there had moved to work as loggers, miners, construction workers, and other hard labor. They lacked connections, and while you could screw them out of a few copper here and there, the people they worked for were already squeezing them for everything they were worth. The people in Midtown often had just as little, but they were better at using it, more able to turn things to their own advantage, and more corrupt. Dantes felt much more home with them. Dantes found a small set of shops and started looking through them. He found a number of herbalists, but none were the particular one he was looking for. They were run by men or kobolds, but eventually he found one named Hema's Herbs, and he walked inside. The shop smelled richly of herbs, and Dantes took a moment to enjoy their scent before looking around the rest of the shop. There were dried plants hanging in the windows tied by short strings, jars full of strange powder goods, and even a few potions scattered around. A dwarven woman with thick dark curls throughout which he saw a small mushroom sprouting. Smelling is free, but if you want to do anything else, you'll need to buy it. Dantes smiled at the woman and patted one of his pockets filled with coin. Don't worry, I'm here to buy. He spread his awareness through all of the plants nearby, finding that all of them were well cared for. He also detected at least one other person watering some plants in the back. I'm looking for, I suppose you could call it a sampler? A mixture of seeds, specimens, maybe some of these potions and powders. Anything local. That's an interesting request. You gonna try to compete with me? Dantes smiled. No, I have a colleague who's visiting from far away and wanted to know a bit more about what was local. She shrugged. Well, as long as you're paying. He found himself drifting so a small patch of bright mushrooms as they spoke. He reached out to touch one of them. What are these? Hema glanced over. She was preparing a small canvas bag and carefully assembling what he'd requested. Those? They're violet prosa. They grow in caves and mines around here. You dry them and powder them, then mix a small amount into your food or drink to strengthen the heart and help soothe sore muscles. I don't usually recommend it, though. Too much of it can make your heart rate increase and cause paranoia. Dantes smiled widely. Oh, really? He looked at the 5 or 6 mushrooms that were there. You wouldn't happen to have some already prepared? She looked at him with a raised eyebrow, but seemed to stop short of questioning him aloud. I work on the docks. Sir Muscles, you know. She gave an unconvinced nod. Sure, I'll throw some in with everything else. I'll take a fresh one, too. She shrugged. It's your gold. She grabbed a label jar and packed it into a quickly filling canvas bag. Dantes leaned on the counter while she continued her collecting and picked at his teeth a bit. So, do you mind if I go into your greenhouse and say hi to Clay? Her attention snapped to him, and he noticed her gripping one of the glass jars hard as if she planned to throw it. It seemed his intuition had been right. He'd been looking for Clay's sister's shop specifically, more out of sense that he should do a friend a good turn than anything, but the fact that Clay himself was there, that was just providence. He held up a hand. It's okay. I'm an escapee too. I'm not here to get anyone in any trouble. She loosened her grip on the jar, but only slightly. I don't know what you're talking about. Dantes sighed. It's a little late to lie about it. I truly mean him no harm. He sold me weed a few times. I wouldn't call us friends exactly, but I just want to talk to him. May have a job if he's interested. She gripped the jar harder again and actually raised it a bit. I won't let him get mixed up in that kind of thing again. It's okay, Hema, said Clay, pushing open the door at the back of the shop. He nodded. Hello, Dantes. This is Dantes, she asked incredulously. The deceiver? Fitting, San Jacopo. This tale has been unlawfully lifted without the author's consent. Report any appearances on Amazon. True, but not exactly good for my reputation, responded Dantes. I told you that's what other prisoners have begun calling him. Not that it's what I call him, said Clay. Dantes nodded back at Clay. Hello, Clay. Clay beckoned him with dirt-covered hands. Come on back. Dantes did so, giving a polite nod to Hema as he did. He hesitated and pointed at the bag. I'll still be paying for all that. She sighed. I'll hold it. The room in the back of the store was a greenhouse with glass that was somehow warped in such a way that it let in light, but one couldn't see through it. There were plants he recognized, having just seen them hanging dried in the window, as well as a healthy row of weed that he sensed hidden behind some of the taller plants in the front. Clay sat in the center of it on a stone bench, and Dantes sat next to him. I'm glad to see that you made it out. He smiled. Have you to thank for that, I suppose, though I may not have needed to leave in such a way if not for you. Dantes grimaced. I heard. He removed some of the hair from his face. I didn't know that was going to happen, but that doesn't matter. What is done is done. I'm glad that you made it out, though. He nodded. I was lucky. When we made the breakout, in numbers I was square in the middle of things. I just kind of crawled one eye off the tree. He scratched his beard, knocking loose a mushroom, which he popped into his mouth. Before I knew it, I'd made it out. Do you think you'll leave the city? At it novel been at. No, Hema's the only family I've got. I miss the woods, but our old town got hit by some kind of plague a while back. There's nothing left there. I'll just have to hide out here. You're not collared. The only people who may know that you were a prisoner are the guard that arrested you and the judge that sentenced you. There's a good chance they wouldn't even recognize you if they saw you. He stroked his beard. I suppose that's true. I still worry, though. Dantes looked around the greenhouse and made a sweeping gesture across it. You and your sister did all this? Clay nodded. Yes, though she expanded quite a bit on what I started with her. I mostly just wanted to grow weed to sell in town. Something about the dirt here makes it especially hard to grow. Oddly enough, the soil in the Underprison grew it without any problem, though. Also, unfortunately, the gatemen don't like local producers since they import everything. Got into a scrap and accidentally broke a man's neck. It's easy to forget how frail halflings can be sometimes. Dantes looked at Clay's powerful hands. It can be, yes. So, I heard you tell Hema you have a job for me. I do, but it's nothing illegal actually. Clay laughed, then looked to see that Dantes wasn't smiling. Oh, you're serious? I mean, I'll be paying you with money I got illegally, but what you'll be doing isn't something the guard will fuss about. Clay chuckled. Good. I wouldn't have believed you if there wasn't at least a little grime on the offer. Dantes smiled. All that I would want from you is to help me garden. Clay stroked his beard. And you won't make me grow weed? He shrugged. Not unless you want me to. And these aren't like the blood garden that was in the pit? Dantes shook his head. No, that was a mistake. Had I known, well, I still may have done it, but it's not necessary here. I've just been expanding beyond what I think I can maintain myself, and I know that you're a rare talent when it comes to growing things. I'm guessing these gardens have something to do with you being a druid? Dantes considered misdirection, but decided against it. How could he lie when Clay had seen so much overwhelming evidence? That's right. He raised his hand and sent his will out through the garden, making the plants shift back and forth as if they were being blown by the wind. I don't see what a druid would need me for. Can't you just dash? He made a series of strange hand motions. I can, to an extent, do things like that, but it takes energy, and I have the impression that some of what I do needs to be done the hard way. But you don't want to do them the hard way. Dantes shrugged. I'll do some of it, but I need help. Simple as that. What's the pay? A gold a week. His eyes widened, which will likely increase as the gardens grow. Clay rubbed his beard a bit more. I don't know. Where are the gardens? Scattered around the southwestern part of the inner city, in old areas that have been sealed by the guard and forgotten. 1 gold, 5 silver. 1 gold, 2. Deal. Clay stood and spat in his hand, offering it to Dantes. Dantes mimicked the gesture and clasped Clay's hand, giving it a firm shake. Deal. Do you need me to start today, Dantes shook his head. No, I'll come get you in the morning tomorrow and show you what you're working with. We can discuss what materials you need to buy after that. They'll be on me, obviously. Clay nodded, and Dantes and him walked back out into the main area of the shop, where Hema was crushing something with a mortar and pestle. 2 gold, she said, offhandedly pointing at the sack she'd prepared for him. Gold? Asked Dantes incredulously. Don't think I'm so foolish to think that you're buying those mushrooms just for sore muscles. Dantes smiled. I'll pay you the gold, if you take the time to teach me what everything in this bag you've prepared for me does. Deal. She looked at Dantes, then Clay, who gave her subtle thumbs up. She spat in her palm and held out her hand. Deal. Dantes wound his way back up through the outer city and back to where his boots clacked comfortably against concrete. The sun was high, and he'd spent several hours getting information on the different local plants that Hema had sold him. Though Clay had frequently interrupted her so they could bicker on the fine points of what certain things did, the overall lesson had been clear. He took no breaks and was grateful that he'd recovered as much as he had in such a short time since his blood garden had been destroyed. Now the key would be to make it so that he could never be weakened like that again. He walked down the center of a wide and empty street as he considered next steps. There was a loud crack, and suddenly he found himself spinning and falling onto the ground. He felt a white-hot pain in his back left shoulder, and he clutched at it with the opposite hand, feeling blood pouring from a wound. He regained his footing and started running, just as another cracking noise rang out and a piece of concrete next to him burst. He wove, tried to mimic the pattern he'd seen Gawain run in to avoid gunfire, and narrowly avoided 2 more shots as he dove into a nearby alley. Gritting his teeth, he sent his will out and summoned a cloud of bats to begin a search in the vicinity the bullets seemed to be coming from. The shooter had to be a large distance away, as the vermin he had watching things in front of and behind him hadn't detected anything. As he did so, he moved further down the alley, but stopped before it opened up into a wider square between 4 buildings. He detected a lot of movement in that direction. He began to turn back, when another shot rang out, and he found his legs pushing him into the square. At the same time, he adjusted the swarm of bats he'd sent out and found the shooter. He was a dwarf sitting on the rooftop of a building behind him, which meant either he was a very fast dwarf or he had an accomplice. The dwarf had a short, well-trimmed beard and wore an immaculate black outfit with a number of heavy ammo pouches. He was crouched over a long gun of some kind with a barrel as tall as he was, and a second one right next to it, presumably to alternate shots. Dantes had the bats descend on the man, but was immediately forced to turn his attention away as he entered the cleared block. A group of 10 dwarves, all with guns pointed in his direction, and all wearing full plate armor with their faceplates closed. He raised up his hands, letting Jacopo slide out of his pants leg and run toward cover. One of them stepped forward and slid open his faceplate. It was iron in the mine. He looked much the same as he had the last time Dantes had seen him in person. Broad, dark hair and beard braided through gold and silver beads and rings, and a blunderbuss. This time, however, he was missing a couple fingers and wore an eye patch. Dantes began bringing all the nearby vermin he could closer, and reached out to sense if there was any plant life nearby that could help him. Unfortunately, he sensed only concrete. Lead in the chamber does good work for an untouchable. Brought you right to us, just as promised. Dantes' attention flickered to the bats nearby who were chasing the dwarf that had been shooting at him, presumably Lead, across rooftops. He was incredibly agile. Iron, he said, nodding at him. Deceiver. But you weren't expecting to see me. Dantes suppressed a quip about Iron's now missing eye. Can't say I was, no. What's this about? The narrative has been taken without authorization. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. No, you aren't going to be able to pretend you don't know what you did. I lost dozens of good men to your bloody garden. And I know that it was you that shot me. At it novel been it at. I'm good at hiding and sneaking, but I'm not that good. No, but the animals you control are. Animals? What do you mean? Said Dantes, even as he gathered more rats and roaches, bringing the swarm of bats back toward himself. You're a druid. I remember learning about you all as a child. My grandfather used to speak of one that lived in the endless mountain, one who cultivated forests of mushrooms and summoned creatures from the dankest corners of it to protect what he grew. They hunted him, of course. His gardens were in the way of a gold deposit. Dantes kept his face passive. Sounds like a good reason to kill someone. He began gathering his wool into the branch, moving it up to wrap itself around and brace his wound. This, though, he gestured to the dwarves with all of their guns trained on him. Seems unnecessary. Why stay in Rendhold? Aren't you nobility? Is revenge on me really worth staying here and in danger? Iron nodded. It absolutely is. He raised his gun to aim at Dantes. Dantes sighed, then let his hands drop to his side. Disagreeing with that would only make me a hypocrite. He released his will, and a branch wrapped around his left arm shot forward through his jacket and pushed the barrel of Iron's blunderbuss away from him just as he pulled the trigger. Dantes dove to the side as the shot went off and unleashed the vermin he'd been gathering at the same time. Bats, rats, and roaches all swarmed the dwarves. The square became a sea of movement as roaches crawled into the seams in the dwarves' armor. Rats tried to pry open their faceplates, and bats blinded them. Some of the dwarves managed to pull the triggers on their weapons, causing an explosion of viscera as the vermin that surrounded them were turned to paste. But they were unable to reload afterward, as roaches stuffed themselves into the barrels of their guns. Once they all seemed to have fired a shot, Dantes moved into action. He pulled his stiletto out and worked his way from the outside in. He sent his branch forward to pry open the dwarves' faceplates, then jammed his knife into their eyes. It brought back memories of his assault on the orcs back in the pit. By the end of it, his favor was drained, but not gone, and he was breathing heavily covered in his blood, that of the creatures he'd summoned, and that of the dwarves. Only Iron was left, writhing on the ground as the vermin scratched and tore what flesh they could reach. Dantes reached down to pick up one of the guns that the dwarves had dropped, this one still cocked and loaded. He winced at the burning pain in his shoulder and walked over to Iron, calling the vermin off of him. Iron writhed a bit longer before realizing he was no longer being bitten into. Then he forced himself up. Dantes smiled down at him, pointing the barrel of the gun at his faceplate. He didn't know much about guns, but he felt that from this range the bullet would likely tear through the armor without much issue. "For what I hear, this won't be the first time a man has put his gun to your face," said Dantes, smirking. Iron said nothing, but Dantes guessed he was gritting his teeth behind the visor. "Sorry, that was low. Let me come up with something better." He pulled the trigger, and red sprayed from the back of Iron's head onto the vermin behind him. He rubbed his arm, which seemed to be buzzing a bit from the force of the shot. He looked over as Jacopo returned from his cover. "They are more powerful than expected," said Jacopo, indicating the gun. "Yes, but at least I had the heads up from being with you when you used one." Dantes sent the vermin permission to feed and leaned against a wall, removing his jacket to view his bullet wound. It looked like the bullet had passed through cleanly, but his muscle there would likely be damaged forever unless he could find a healer or get his hands on a healing potion. He had a bit of one left from when he killed Gaspard, but he wasn't sure that there was enough to fully heal him. He willed his branch to wrap back around and compress the wound, then began to pull his coat back on. He heard a commotion and sensed movement coming nearer. "Fuck," he said as he shifted into rat form and leaned against the wall. His wound followed him, and he needed to walk on 3 legs to find cover. Just as he took cover, Orbus, Wayne, and Merle entered the square. Orbus had a spear, Wayne a large club, and Merle his brick-like fists. They were all still wearing collars, and they came to a dead stop as they saw the sea of vermin feasting on the dead dwarfs. Merle sighed heavily, dropping his hands to his side. "Seems he didn't need our help after all." Dantes didn't make his former collared friends wait in a pit of dwarven corpses and vermin for long. He shifted back to himself and leaned against the wall behind him, coughing lightly into his fist to get their attention. They turned and looked at him, and Dantes waved. It was a risk, but they were still collared, and that meant any contest of strength was dramatically in his favor, especially while they were all still surrounded by the vermin he'd summoned. "Dantes," said Wayne, stepping toward him with an empty palm raised. "Wayne," responded Dantes, and they clapped hands together before drawing one another into a brief half-hug. "It's good to see you alive." Dantes looked at Orbus and Merle. "All 3 of you." "You as well," said Merle, gesturing at the corpses being eaten, though our concerns seemed to be unwarranted. Dantes nodded. "We shouldn't stay here long." He moved over and began looting the corpses, grabbing guns, bullets, gunpowder, a few coin purses, and a dwarven signet ring off of Iron's hand. Toward the end of it, his bag was getting heavy. "You want some guns?" he asked. Orbus and Wayne both nodded, and began looking through the bodies for one. Merle abstained. "I suppose you already have 2. "Huh," said Dantes, eliciting a chuckle from the 3 of them. From there, Dantes led them through a number of back alleys and isolated streets until they reached his main garden. What had been a patch of dirt covered in the debris of a collapsed building had changed significantly since he'd begun improving it. The majority of the ground was covered in clover, strawberries, and moss. 2 fruit trees stood tall on either end of it, and a small pool of water with low plants sat near the edge, pigeons and rats sipping from it as other vermin wove their way around. The partially collapsed building in the corner was filled with bats, starting to stir as the sun set. Dantes set down his pack, that was now full of an odd combination of guns and herbs, and pulled the plants that were still living, as well as the seeds, and began finding places for them. Listening to the plants' input as he gently placed each of them in their own separate places, working to force his mind to remember what each of the plants did as he placed them there. Merle, Wayne, and Orbus stood at the edge of the garden, anxiety clear on their faces. Dantes took several candles and lit them using Tell's finger, then gestured for them to come further into the garden. "Don't worry, no blood in this garden." They still hesitated, but then Dantes saw a twinkle in Merle's eye. "That finger. Where did you get it?" Dantes held it in the palm of his hand for a moment. "It was Tell's. I wanted to make sure his last request was granted." Merle stepped into the garden. "I didn't think you were the sentimental type." Dantes shrugged. "Only when it comes to death and revenge." Wayne and Orbus followed Merle, and they all sat in a small square near Dantes' bedroll. He hadn't exactly expected guests, and wasn't about to haul furniture into his garden on the off chance he had them. "So, how did you find me?" asked Dantes after a few moments of silence. "We didn't," said Wayne, smiling through his tusks. "Iron did. We just followed him." "You knew he'd come after me?" asked Dantes. "This narrative has been unlawfully taken from Royal Road. If you see it on Amazon, please report it." Merle nodded this time. "Yes, he made that very clear before we broke out." "But you three didn't share his goal?" They exchanged glances. "Many of the collar did, but we saw more nuance in the situation," said Merle, flexing his powerful hands as he spoke. "We didn't believe that you knew what would happen to your garden when you left it to us." Dantes nodded solemnly. "I didn't know. One policy of the academies, and of Rendhold itself, that I've always disagreed with is that anyone who awakens into their mage abilities should be punished for what he does before he is aware of them. I've seen young men and women hung for making a person's heart stop or starting a fire when they had no true awareness of what they were doing. I'd be a hypocrite to come after you for that. Whether I knew or not, I'm sorry. I'll do what I can to repay what I did." Merle nodded and pointed at his collar. "This is what we need the most right now. We need to get these removed. You don't have any contacts that can take care of that for you?" "No. The Academy has threatened the pit or death for any that encounter a collard and do not immediately go to the authorities. Aside from that, unlike the other prisoners that escaped, we are easily marked for what we are. That makes it harder for us to move freely. I assume it's not just you three that need it." "We have a dozen men hiding in a warehouse," said Orbus. "Only a dozen. Some died in the pit. Some were killed or captured trying to escape it. More made a run for the docks or the gates. From what we can tell, almost no gang stayed intact after escaping. We were bound by the need for survival in the pit. There was nothing else keeping them together." Dantes nodded along as Merle spoke. He could hardly blame anyone for leaving the city after escaping the pit. That was almost certainly the smart thing to do. "I'm guessing not just any mage would do." Merle shook his head. "No. It would need to be an incredible healer, or someone very well equipped to deal with breaking enchantments. I've been studying our collars for a long time, and it would take a specialist to get us out. There was no back door purposefully created to allow their removal. We were expected to die wearing them. Also means we can't just kidnap a random mage off the street," Dantes muttered, removing the easiest option from his train of thought. "I have a man who owes me quite a lot. I think I can get him to help us. I already have a meeting later in the week where he's meant to give me a few items made for breaking enchantments." "What's his name?" asked Merle, stroking his beard. "Felix." All three of them raised eyebrows, as if surprised at the name. "Do you know him?" Orbus nodded. "I taught him for a number of years. Incredibly adept at binding, breaking, and enchantments, and terrible at everything else." He tapped his collar. "He could be the perfect person for it. Hadn't novel been at." Merle shook his head. "No, he was far too straight-laced and by the book. He wouldn't even share a drink with the other young professors, too busy working toward tenure." Wayne let out a hearty belly laugh. "When I was in the academy, he was one of my professors, and he was one of the most ignoble rakes I've ever had the privilege of studying under. He would show up to teach hungover frequently, encourage students to gamble, and frequently accepted female students' trades of favors for better marks. I guess he was saving all of his degeneracy for after he received tenure. Dantes listened as they spoke, only just realizing that Orbus may in fact be older than Merle. Sometimes that was an easy thing to forget when talking with the elf-blooded. He noticed Merle's expression darkening as he listened to Wayne speak. "The academy system is broken beyond repair," he muttered darkly, flexing muscles that Dantes didn't even know existed. Merle let out a long breath. "He seems like our best option. Dantes, you're certain you can bring him to us? He owes me quite a lot of money, and more than a few favors. He also already left his fingerprints all over a key that can break the vermin-resistance enchantments. I'm assuming that's something that could get him in serious trouble with the academy." Merle nodded. "He could lose his tenure for that. The enchantments on buildings provided by the academy are a large part of its revenue. The academy doesn't want their money fucked with. It's their highest priority. Dantes nodded. I figured as much. My plan was to get his fingerprints on him more and more until he was fully under my control. But if we get him to remove your collars, I'd say that just speeds things up. Merle chuckled. I'm grateful we're on your side. Well, I may need a favor or two after you get those collars off. Of course, though our priorities may be a bit different from yours. Merle looked around. You wouldn't happen to have any excess food? My men are having difficulty maintaining their mass. Dante smiled. I have another garden that produces a bit more food than this one. They're welcome to their fill. He moved over to an extra pack he had by his bedroll and pulled out a small sack that he tossed to Merle. You're also welcome to that. Merle opened the sack and brought it to his nose, inhaling deeply and smiling. He scooped some of the fine powder out and put the dry powder straight into his mouth. Way, gods, I've missed it. Dantes adjusted the black cloak he'd wrapped around himself, clasping it with a bronze pin in the shape of a triangle in the center of a circle, a symbol thought to represent stability in magic, and one worn by the members of the Academy when they were on official business or on the grounds of the Academy itself. Dantes kept walking across the massive bridge that led into the first of the 3 towers, under which a massive river rushed. There was a part of him that wanted to stand still and admire the view. Taken the way the towers rose so high he couldn't see their tops, all 3 of them connected by bridges at several points up their length, strange purple mists, green lightning, and swirling blue fire randomly appearing and disappearing up and down the length of them. Unfortunately, it was important to look like he had somewhere to be, and that meant he couldn't take his time as he might want to. When Felix hadn't shown up at their expected meet, Dantes had immediately sent out his rats, bats, and roaches to search for him at all the places he'd tracked him in since they'd begun doing business. He found no sign of him. That left a few possibilities. Felix had left the city, which would be a strange decision for someone who seemed so focused on his personal comfort and had worked so hard to achieve tenure, or he had decided to stay locked up in the Academy towers to hide away from Dantes. Normally, Dantes would simply wait him out, but with the collard in his garden, time was a factor. Looking busy was the key to infiltrating just about anywhere. If you walk into a halfling's house carrying a box, there's a good chance they won't even react to you. The area around the entrance to the Academy was free to enter by anyone, and there were a number of small shops, mages testing people for magical aptitude, and a few kids throwing rocks off the bridge into the rushing water below. Dantes walked past all of that toward the entrance to the central tower. It was manned by 2 mages and 2 guards, all of them armed in their own ways. The guard did not interfere with the interior of the towers, but did monitor the area directly outside of it. Dantes fell in behind a number of other mages entering the tower, and mimicked them as they flashed their pins at the guard before moving on. Merle, Wayne, and Orbus had given him the general rundown of the towers and what he would need to do. The main entrance had no magical barriers, aside from the anti-vermin enchantment. From there, the passages were all defended by different magical codes and passwords that were given to students, professors, and licensed mages regularly. But all of them could also be answered like exam questions or riddles. Dantes approached the least busy door to the staircase. At this time of day, more people were leaving than entering the tower. Dantes looked at the series of ruins around the door, noting that where they were shifted each time someone pressed one of them. Above the door was a series of symbols in elvish that he didn't recognize. He shifted his attention to Jacopo, who was sitting by a fire with Wayne, Orbus, and Merle. Dantes had the 100 roaches he'd connected to swarm onto the patch of open space in front of them. Else, yelled Orbus, jumping backward when one of the roaches got a bit too close to his feet. Calm down. Dantes must have reached the first door, said Wayne, looking at Jacopo, who confirmed with a nod. They figured out this method of long-range communication as a group, though from the beginning Orbus hadn't been keen on it, instead hoping to have Jacopo attempt to write things down, which the rat had no patience for. Dantes moved the roaches into the exact configuration of the letters he was looking at. Merle stroked his beard. A simple question about the remaining regent in a simple elemental binding. The answer is spider silk. Dantes looked at the series of ever-changing symbols above the doorframe and sent his confusion to Jacopo, who shrugged at them. "Here," said Wayne, writing a symbol in the dirt with his pointer finger. Jacopo moved to view it from Wayne's perspective, and Dantes looked at the symbols again, placing his hand on it and feeling his fingers tingle as the door opened. Luckily, he hadn't seemed to raise any suspicions by taking his time there, but that may have been due to the long practice he'd had in what he liked to call active loitering. He walked in such a way that his boot came loose, then accidentally stepped on his own cloak and sent the class flying. All of this made him look like a fool, of course, but his ego could handle that if it meant he reached his goal. Dantes started climbing stairs, slipping by students, professors, and other staff as he climbed several flights. The tenured professors slept near the top of the furthest tower. There were several ways to get there, but the majority of them were passing through large crowds of people or a dozen coded entrances. He'd worked with the collard to pick a path that, while very winding and indirect, would reduce the chances that he was discovered. The story has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the violation. He made it nearly halfway up the tower before he needed to enter another door. This time went more smoothly, with him far more quickly sending the message and receiving an answer from Wayne through Jacopo almost immediately. He pressed an Orcish rune 3 times, and the door opened. From there things continued smoothly as he made his way through. There were several doors that scanned specifically for magical acuity, but Dantes managed to make his way around those, using alternate directions as he needed them. The key to all of it was to always be moving with purpose, which kept anyone from questioning him. He finally reached the door that was meant to take him to the bridge straight to the professor's quarters, and standing in front of it was a woman with a sword on one hip and a wand on the other, leaning in front of the door. There was a riddle above the door, but that didn't concern him as much. The only issue was based on the directions he'd been given and what he'd seen so far. This was the only door that would let him avoid any doors scanning for magical acuity. He approached the door confidently, and the woman held up her hand. "Sorry, scholar, this bridge is closed. Can I ask why?" "Spell went wrong. Whole bridge is underwater." "What?" She sighed. "Easier just to show you." She touched a rune that he quickly memorized above the door and opened it. Dantes resisted jumping as water sloshed slightly out of the doorway, then moved back behind it, as if commanded to do so by an invisible force. Dantes glimpsed through it and saw a tunnel of water extending further than he could see. Furniture, curtains, and somehow a few fish all floated within the water. He managed to say to fill the void in the conversation. The guard nodded. "Yeah, so go take one of the other bridges." Dantes quickly had the roaches spell out a simple question to the collard as he talked. If he could just become a roach or rat to get through, it wouldn't be a problem, but they had all advised against that. The enchantments in the academy were a completely different beast than those outside of it. If he shifted, he could explode, be teleported outside the towers to fall to the ground below, or have his insides and outside switch places. None of which was appealing. "Listen, I have maybe 15 minutes to talk to my professor, or I'm screwed, possibly literally if that's what I need to do to keep from failing." She looked him up and down. "I don't know that you'd have much luck with that offer." He sighed heavily. "Do you need to kick me while I'm down? You think you can swim the length of the bridge without drowning or falling off the side, and that'll be faster than if you just go down the stairs and take one of the other paths? My father was a sailor. I swim faster than I can climb steps." She looked as if she was about to deny him entry anyway, then hesitated. "Which professor?" Dantes looked at the message the collard had written. "Salieri." The guard's eyes widened. "Ah, shit. Just go. Do me a favor, though, and if you die, try your best to fall off the side." Dantes nodded at her. "I'll do my very best." He moved to the far and away from the door, then ran forward and dove headfirst into the water. That initial dive got him a solid 7 feet forward. From there, he began pushing with powerful strokes, dodging a floating shelf and crate that must have been on the bridge when the spell was cast. He asked all of the fish to steer clear, and they were kind enough to do so as he pushed himself further and further. He estimated that the bridge was roughly 100 feet from one end to the other, but after swimming for 2 minutes and not seeing the end, he began to panic. He was already worn out from the stairs, and still drained from losing his blood garden. Still, he swam forward. He raised his arm, focusing his will on his branch and extending it into a long hook to allow him to grip loose railings and pull himself forward. He saw a window open on one side and moved toward it until he reached the window and stuck just his head out of it. He gasped for breath, his eyes widening as he saw the precipice drop below him. Vertigo assailed him, and for a moment he could swear that he was starting to slide forward and out of the water. He turned his head to the side to see he had only 20 or so feet left. Dantes steeled himself and pulled back into the water, swiftly moving toward the door, where he realized there was another puzzle. He focused his will to move the roaches into the correct configuration of Kobayashi thought lettering. "Oh, that's an interesting one," said Orbus, overcoming his discomfort at the roaches long enough to look. "A very old-school riddle. Makes sense for this part of the furthest tower," agreed Merle. "Is the answer sanguine vitae? Or perhaps magica fuentes?" asked Wayne. "It really depends on if we're meant to give the answer that would commonly be expected, or the one we actually think it is," said Merle. Dantes clenched his jaw, his lungs feeling heavier and his focus waning from his exertion. Jacopo moved over to Wayne and bit him on the ankle. "Shit," he howled. "At it novel Benedette." Jacopo mimed drowning, and the Collard looked at one another, and each of them produced a symbol. Dantes pressed on each one, the third being the correct one, perfectly representing his luck, and the door swung open. He pushed himself out of the water with a final powerful stroke and landed panting and soaked on the ground in front of the door. No one was nearby, likely because they knew on this end that it was sealed, and so he took some time to recover. "Can I ask what the answer was?" requested Wayne. Dantes moved the roaches into the shape of a massive member flanked by two asses. Mages, they just couldn't help themselves. Dantes walked along the hall, dripping wet in his disguise with his boots, squelching with every step. The corridor he stood in was long with doors on either side, seemingly too close together to house actual rooms. He moved to the far end and climbed the staircase up to the second highest level where tenured professors had rooms. Luckily, the rooms were labeled with different names and titles, which saved Dantes the trouble of knocking on one door after another until he reached the right one. He reached the door labeled Felix Feynman, third professor of enchantment. He rolled his neck, hearing a series of loud cracks from it as he did so, and shaped the branch in his hand into a fine point. Then he knocked on the door. There was no sound on the other end of the door, almost as if it was empty, but just when Dantes thought he might not be there, the door swung open suddenly, and Felix stood there in a thick, comfortable robe with a pipe hanging from the corner of his mouth and a book tucked under his arm. Before he could even realize what was happening, Dantes pushed into the room, grabbed his mouth, shoved him down to the ground, and pressed the point of his branch into his throat, kicking the door closed as he did so. The motion was smooth, practiced, and over in less than a second. Felix's eyes widened, and he started to scream until Dantes drove the point of his branch just deep enough to draw a small pinprick of blood. "Hello, Felix. You missed our last meeting." He rested his knee on Felix's stomach, putting his full weight on it. "I was beginning to get a little worried about you." He removed his hand. Felix grimaced in pain, but tried to speak. "How did you dash?" Dantes backhanded him firmly. "How did I get here?" Easily and with minimal effort, which you would do well to remember. Dantes stood and hauled Felix to his feet before chucking him against a wall. Then he scooped up the pipe that he'd dropped and took a long inhale of it himself. "Oh, that's good tobacco." He grabbed Felix's arm and emptied the hot contents of it onto his forearm. Felix yelped in pain, and Dantes slipped the pipe into his cloak. "Are you going to kill me?" asked Felix, cowering. "I should. You welched on a debt. Your death would be more than fair in return for that." Felix trembled slightly and started to eye the door. "Did you complete what I asked from you?" I did." "Show me." Felix slowly pushed himself off the wall and began moving further into his apartment. Dantes followed closely, just at that moment started to take things in. They were in a spacious sitting room, with a fireplace roaring in the middle and a series of large and comfortable-looking chairs scattered around, sitting atop a rich blue carpet with patterns traced throughout in silver. The apartment was definitely larger on the inside than the outside, and the opulent nature of it made Dantes even angrier, but he stayed focused. Felix was useful and a coward. He could be controlled, and if motivated properly, brought to heel. Felix approached the desk and opened a small drawer. He then reached his entire arm into it and began drawing out a number of items which he placed on the top of the desk. There were a half-dozen more keys, as well as a small craftsman's hammer. Dantes moved closer to the desk and inspected each item. His fingers had been tingling the entire time he'd been in the towers, but he felt a slight spike in the sensation when he touched each object. He moved each item into his cloak, while Felix stood in the corner, his eyes pointed at the ground. This tale has been unlawfully lifted from Royal Road. If you spot it on Amazon, please report it. I suppose you'll be leaving then, he said, trying to find a bit of iron in his spine. Dantes pushed his wet hair back. No. I think I'll spend some time in front of your fire. Then you'll come with me into the city to make sure that these work. I doubt they'd affect the enchantments here at the tower, unless you'd like me to make the attempt. Felix's eyes widened. No, I can do that. After Dantes was sufficiently dried in front of the fire, he and Felix made their way out of the tower without any issue. It was much easier to leave from it, particularly with the professor leading the way. Dantes kept his branch at the base of Felix's neck the whole time, making it look as if they were deep in discussion so as to not raise suspicions. After they were out of the tower, Dantes simply made him move ahead of him as he summoned a perimeter of vermin to keep watch on the comings and goings from all sides. Couldn't you test the items closer to the tower? I could, responded Dantes, and they kept walking. Felix was growing tired and increasingly nervous as they moved, which Dantes was well aware of. By the time they reached the edge of Dantes' garden, he was trembling with both fear and weariness, having only rarely walked so far. Had it novel been at? Dantes pushed open a loose plank he'd been using as a door to enter his garden, gesturing Felix to move through, which he did after a brief hesitation. It wasn't quite nightfall, but a small fire was burning at the center of the garden. Clay was pruning a small tree branch while chatting with Wayne and Orbus. Merle was at a different tree, his robes pulled off his chest as he lifted himself up and down, pulling his bearded chin over a branch as the tree shook, and Dantes could feel its clear displeasure. "Oh gods," muttered Felix as he saw them. Merle dropped down from his pull-ups, clapping his hands together loudly. "Felix, good to see you after all this time." Somehow, Felix managed to turn another shade paler. Dantes patted him on the back. "Now, I bet you're realizing now that I didn't just bring you here so I could test those enchantments." Wayne and Orbus approached as well, and Felix began muttering a number of creative curses under his breath. "The good news is, I didn't bring you here to kill you as I bet you suspected." Dantes gave a wave to Clay, who returned it with a smile as he continued working the garden. "The bad news is, I'm going to need you to remove our friends' collars." "I can't do that. I'll lose my tenure, be thrown into the pit." "It's not so bad," said Wayne. "You can still do some gambling down there, and the changeling whores feel just as good as the real thing." "Don't worry, child," said Orbus, his tone sounding very different to what Dantes was used to hearing from him. "You won't get caught anyway. You were a clever student. I bet you still are." Felix was breathing quickly, the rapid-fire stress of his day catching up with him quickly. "If you don't," said Merle, "we'll just be killing you anyways." He stretched and pulled his robe back over his shoulders. "Won't be able to turn you into a chicken like I did the last one, though." He looked Felix over. "Probably for the best. You look a bit stringy." Felix collapsed onto the ground, his eyes wide as he continued to pant. Dantes moved over to him and crouched down, putting his hand on his shoulder. "Listen, Felix, you don't need to think too hard about this. It's really all very simple. You owe me money, and I have enough enchanted items with your signature all over them that I can easily get your tenure revoked anyway. On top of that, you're outnumbered and will die if you don't cooperate. All that is scary, I know, but let's talk about what happens if you do cooperate. First of all, you live, which is a great deal in and of itself. Secondly, I'll start paying you for anything I need from you, just as I already told you I would. Thirdly, My plans don't stop at being a two-bit criminal. They're far larger than that, and I'd be a good man to have as a friend. Dantes gestured to the collard. So would they, no matter what they're planning, I'd certainly rather be with them than against them, eh? Felix nodded. I suppose so. Dantes moved to his bag that he'd left in the camp and pulled out a small handle of rye. Here, have a sip and take a breath. This is all easy. It was decided the moment you played cards against me. Fighting it won't help anything. Just do your part, and we'll all be better off for it. Felix took a long, deep swig of the whiskey and sighed. And you'll start paying me after this? Dante smiled. Yes. Orbus looked at Wayne. Are we sure he doesn't have some kind of magic? Once Felix had completely resigned himself to his fate, he actually began to seem as if he was enjoying the prospect of breaking the collars. He and the other mages began to theorize and work toward the safest way to break them. They spoke quickly and enthusiastically to one another, but to Dantes they may as well have all been speaking some dead tongue he'd never heard before. Still, he recognized the look in all of their eyes as they spoke. It reminded him of how he felt when he was planning a big heist. Dantes left them to it, only staying nearby so that he could pick the lock on the collars once they reached that point. He went to his bedroll and laid down. He was sore and tired. His body continued to replenish itself through its connection to his gardens throughout the city, but he estimated it would still be a few weeks before he was back to full strength. Luckily, his powers and mental acuity hadn't suffered. Jacopo moved over the bedroll as well, munching on a sliver of salted beef. Good job acting as a translator, said Dantes. It was difficult. Mages are stupid. Dantes nodded. Very. Dantes pulled the enchanted keys and hammers from his cloak and looked at them. He could now bring multiple rats or bats into a building at once, or spy on several. Roaches would be out of the question, unfortunately, due to their size in comparison with the keys. Dantes spread his awareness across each of his gardens. They were all growing strong, filled with life. Clay seemed to be doing an excellent job maintaining things for him, though he'd have to pay his own visits as well to make sure everything flowed as it should. He frowned. There was one thing he'd been meaning to do, but hadn't had a chance to. Jacopo. The rat twitched a gold eye in his direction. Dantes, you up for an infiltration of your own? No, I was very busy. You flailed your hands and nodded your head a few times. Yes, very tiring. At novel Benedette. I want you to look around Mondego's manor. Jacopo stopped mid-bite, and Dantes could feel him pulling briefly on Dantes's resounding hatred. This I can do. Jacopo made the trek easily, having little trouble scurrying undetected through to Midtown until he found the manor Dantes had triangulated with roaches more than a month before. The manor had changed drastically from Dantes's memories of it. In the past, it had been a worn-down and dilapidated building with a sagging roof and boarded-up windows. But in spite of that, it had a kind of character to it. A subtle nobility with a number of more delicate and hard-to-notice features, such as hand-carved patterns on the side of the entryway stairs, and latticework done in intricate patterns on the window shutters. While the dilapidation had been remedied, that subtle character was now completely impossible to see. Large marble columns had been added to the front, and the subtle stone and woodwork of it were now covered in gaudy coats of expensive paint and gold filigree. There was a garden surrounding the building, but it was all drake-tier flowers, Mercedes's favorite, which choked the life out of anything else that may have grown nearby had it simply been trimmed back or planted in a more subtle way. There were also small spikes placed around the roof to prevent birds from roosting and large scar dogs chained in the yard to deter intruders and intimidate visitors. Dantes' scowl was sensed by Jacopo, even through the great distance between them. But Jacopo himself was more interested in finding a means of egress. He scurried in a circle around the manor, avoiding the overheated and underfed dogs, and eventually found a window cracked in the rear of it. The smells of cooking meat made his mouth water as he crawled through it, pushed through the anti-vermin enchantment with his key, and fell 8 feet to the floor. He was in a kitchen full of servants, and the signs of a meal being prepared. Jacopo didn't dally there, though he was tempted by the smells and sights around him to stay. Instead, he began searching the house, moving from the outside in. From the kitchen, he found a dining room where some of the food was slowly being moved, but the masters of the house had not yet themselves arrived. Jacopo kept moving, ignoring Dantes' many critiques of the gaudy style of the home as he moved. He found a library covered in a thin layer of dust, separate bedrooms for Mondego and Mercedes, and a closet that would have sufficed as the home of a minor lord. Finally, he came to a large door toward the rear of the home. He could sense that behind the door was a chamber leading down, but he couldn't squeeze under it, nor could he find a way inside. Stolen story, please report. As he was sniffing around it, trying to catch a hint as to its purpose, it suddenly swung open and Jacopo narrowly avoided hitting him. Mondego stepped through the door and slammed it heavily behind himself. He was wearing a dark blue silk shirt and black trousers held up with suspenders. His blonde hair was tousled slightly, and he took a moment to slide a hand through it as he started to make his way toward the dining room. He looked much as Dantes' memories recalled him, except his bearing had changed. In the past, he'd always slouched forward, as if hiding his size, but now he stood tall and walked with a swagger. He pulled a gold cigarette case from his pocket and placed a pre-rolled bit of tobacco into his mouth. A servant appeared, seemingly from thin air, and lit his cigarette as he walked. He blew out a thick cloud of bright pink smoke as he entered the room. Mercedes was already seated at one end of the table, wearing a dark red dress and long black gloves, sipping on a glass of crimson wine and smiling at him as he entered. I wasn't sure if you'd be leaving your basement today. Mondego took another inhale of his cigarette as he sat, and blew it into the air as a servant pushed in his chair. Needed to eat. Haven't had anything since the warehouse was destroyed. Had to spend another afternoon with Irelet and my knuckles, making sure she hadn't sold me out, then all the back and forths with Danglars over him, trying to fuck me over, then explaining to the Fingers Lieutenants that everything will be fine then. All of the bribes to the guard. He flicked an only half-finished cigarette at the wall, causing it to explode in a shower of sparks. Do you think it was Irelet? That she sold you out? He made a fist. No. Mercedes took another sip of her drink, then used a gloved hand to move her long dark hair out her face. Do you think it was him? Mondego smashed a fist on the table, shaking it and causing all of the plates and silverware on it to shift. You'd like that, wouldn't you? If he was back. Mercedes took another long sip of her drink. Do you really think that? I made the same deal you did, my love. She held up her hand, a circle of gold glowing on one finger. I wear the same ring. She stood up and walked across the side of the table to him. There she began to rub his back with her hands, and the tension he was carrying began to fade. I don't think it was him, because I don't think he's that capable. You have him built up in your mind as this great destroyer. I mean, he certainly seemed to do some impressive things in the Underprison, but look at what you've done. He doesn't hold a candle to you, love. He never could. She leaned down, and they shared a long kiss. Disgusting, sent Dantes. It's a normal sign of affection among two legs. No? Not that, them. Jealousy? No. Okay. Jacopo sensed Dantes' frustration that he wasn't taking his denial of envy seriously, but he said nothing else as they watched them continue their meal and eavesdropped. Mercedes moved back to her seat at the table and took another small sip of wine. You know, you would probably benefit from checking in on your operations in person. You haven't left the manor in months. Your lieutenants are talking. Mondego shrugged. If they try anything, they die. Who gives a fuck if they're talking? You should at least do something to Danglars. We may suspect others were involved, but your people and the smugglers don't know that. What do you suggest? I can't exactly have him killed or beaten over it. He's too useful. No, but if something happened to those pretty secretaries of his, that may be more than a little distressing, and let the men know you're no coward. Mondego cut into his steak, a cruel smile on his face. You're a real bitch. True. They exchanged a few more comments on the food and on business, which Dantes did his best to absorb as he listened in through Jacopo. Before they could actually enjoy their meal, though, a maid approached Mondego with an envelope sealed with gold wax. Open it. We can't afford mistakes now. Mondego eyed the fresh plate of filleted fish that had just been placed in front of him and scowled. He grabbed the envelope and tore it open, reading it quickly. He pushed away from the table with a loud groan and roughly pushed a servant carting in more platters as he moved back toward the back of the building that he'd emerged from. Jacopo quickly scurried behind him, not wanting to lose sight of him. Mondego went back to the sealed door toward the back and pulled it open. Then he began to descend down a long flight of stairs that seemed to extend for more than 100 feet down into the earth. At the very bottom of it, Mondego clapped his hands and a series of torches lit the room. The chamber was enormous, and in the center of it was a pile of gold, silver, jewelry, and gems taller than Mondego and appearing to perfectly fill an 8-foot square. Jacopo was momentarily overwhelmed by Dantes' emotions as he thought through all he could do with such a hoard, and he stood staring at the shining gold with his whiskers twitching and his eyes wide. The feeling of one was quickly overwhelmed by a different feeling, though. There was something wrong about the pile of treasure. A sense of rot and decay seemed to surround it, and Jacopo's instincts, and those of Dantes, began to scream to run from it. Mondego hesitated as he reached the pile of gold, and he reached a hand toward it for just a moment before pulling it back and clenching his fist with a scowl on his face. Then he approached a wall to the right where a large oval mirror stood. Nothing reflected in the mirror, and Mondego didn't pause his stride as he walked straight through it. Jacopo didn't hesitate either. "Wait," sent Dantes, projecting concern, but Jacopo walked into the mirror before he could react to the thought. Moving through a mirror was very different from moving through trees. With the trees, there was a sense of oneness with everything and a loss of ego. But with the mirror, there was only an intense discomfort and awareness of something other watching, followed by a sudden return to reality as one steps through the other side where it connects. Jacopo shook his head and scurried into a dark corner behind a plant to regain his senses. His connection to Dantes had faded, and he spent a moment focusing on reconnecting to him. "Are you okay?" sent Dantes. "Yes." Dantes tried to measure where they were in relation to one another, eventually managing to triangulate it. "You're in uptown somewhere." Jacopo sent an affirmative and took a moment to peek out from behind the plant and look around. He was in a building with a thick carpet interwoven with images of nude demon women in salacious poses that reminded Dantes of Tell's etchings he'd left us in. The walls were covered in purple curtains, and a woman wearing no top approached Mondego as he lit another cigarette, this time blowing out a smoke of bright cyan. "Mr. Mondego, we weren't expecting to see you back so soon. I have a meeting with Godfrey." "Yes, sir. He just reserved a room next to where the fingers met you earlier." Mondego took another inhale and blew more smoke into the air. I want a room with you after my meeting. And a steak. Make it happen." The woman nodded. "Yes, sir." Mondego walked through the opulently and sinfully appointed halls with Jacopo close behind him, taking his time to follow him. They passed by one large meeting room that Mondego hesitated outside, gritting his teeth and flaring his tusks for just a moment before moving past it. The room beyond that had one woman and one man standing outside of it. They wore gold half-masks and soft smiles that gave Dantes a chill even through Jacopo. They both bowed lightly and pushed each of the doors open, revealing a large open room at the back of which, behind a mask, sat a man whose face seemed to be glowing. Jacopo carefully slipped into the room behind Mondego and climbed into a small gap between two cushions from which he could see everything. From where he was sitting, he got a better glimpse at Godfrey. He was of average height and build, wearing a burgundy shirt buttoned all the way up to the collar and black leather gloves on each hand. What really stood out about him was that his face seemed to be made entirely of liquid gold. Gold eyelids blinked over pupilless gold eyes, gold lips peeled back into a smile revealing golden teeth, and as he spoke a golden tongue could be seen shifting in his mouth. "Mondego," Godfrey purred, his voice low and deep. "I'm glad you were able to come on such short notice." Mondego sat, his face an impassive mask, though Dantes knew him well enough to sense he was distressed. "What did you need? Are you in a rush? Need to get back to the missus?" "No, at it novel been at." Godfrey smiled. "You're worried, I can tell." "No," lied Mondego. "You think your recent troubles are Dantes' doing, that your old sacrifice has come back to haunt you." Godfrey looked for a moment, directly into Jacopo's eyes, then looked away. It was just long enough to give Dantes and Jacopo pause, but not long enough to confirm that he'd seen him. The tail has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the violation. Well, I can tell you that's exactly what's happening. Mondiego's eye twitched and his hands clenched tight. What? He's back. He's coming for you and the others. How do you know? That's immaterial. I know it the same way I knew your name before I came to the city. The same way I know that right now there are 900,567 gold, 1,006,000 silver, and 10 million copper currently changing hands at this moment throughout the city. The same way I know that you're not going to tip the whore you have arranged for after this meeting. Mondego stayed silent, his eyes focused on the desk in front of him rather than the unnerving golden eyes of the man smiling across from him. Your old acquaintance Gaspard has already been killed by him, beaten to death before being devoured by vermin. Mondego began to pull another cigarette from his case, placing it to his lips. Danglars took the news poorly, but you seem to be handling it better. Gaspard wasn't worth a boot full of piss. Godfrey smiled. I wouldn't say that. Everyone has their value. How's he doing it? Not killing Gaspard. Any kid with a knife could manage that. But my warehouse? Getting out of the pit. Godfrey cast another too brief glance at Jacopo. It's safe to assume he has a new set of skills and some help. Mondego blew a smoke ring into the air. You know more than you're telling me. Always. That's the nature of our arrangement. Is that what this meeting's about? You telling me bad fucking news to feel like you're better than me? I'm the one on the streets. It's my fists that are covered in blood while you hang out here with whores acting like some fucking noble. Godfrey's smile vanished, and his hand whipped out from the desk and grabbed Mondego's by the ring finger. Gold smoke suddenly seemed to rise from it, and the ring tattoo began turning from gold to black. Wait, cried Mondego. Godfrey released him, and the gold smoke swiftly wrapped itself back around Mondego's finger. Godfrey's smile reappeared on his face. I called you here to give you some advice, a way to give you an edge against your former friend. This meeting is a favor. Don't forget what you owe. Mondego rubbed his ring finger and nodded. Okay, what's this edge? Godfrey's smile widened, and he looked directly at Jacopo, this time his stare unwavering. First, let me remove any prying eyes. Jacopo and Dantes shared an absolute harmony of thought in that moment. Fuck. Jacopo moved from the couch and started sprinting for the door. Godfrey held 2 gold coins between his fingers, which he tossed into the air. Before they landed, they had become golden cats, and they began sprinting after Jacopo. Jacopo squeezed through the slight gap on the bottom of the door and began sprinting toward the nearest window. The 2 masked guards opened the doors for the cats, who didn't slow down at all as they sprinted toward Jacopo. Jacopo couldn't beat them in speed, so he shifted tactics, ducking behind a red fern just as they were about to catch up with him. One of them slammed into the wall, and he took that moment to leap onto its face and claw at its eyes. While it looked to be made of gold, its flesh was soft, and Jacopo tore a hunk of its right eye from it, eliciting a loud screech from it as he leapt away, trailing gold blood behind him as he searched for a window. The other cat stayed hot on his trail as he ducked into a room in which a dozen or so men and women were all tangled together wearing masks as they enjoyed one another's naked forms. Jacopo leapt onto the nearest one, eliciting a screech which swiftly spread through the rest of them as he started climbing through their pile. The cats reached the room too and began scratching and tearing their way through the orgy in an attempt to reach him, further raising the volume of screams that were spreading throughout the chamber. One woman with a high and elaborate hairdo that she had somehow maintained through the undulation of dozens of bodies screamed and backed away toward a window that was cracked open. Jacopo leapt onto her, climbing up through her hair and leaping onto the windowsill, narrowly avoiding the grasp of golden claws as he leapt out the window and began running full speed into the night while Dantes watched, their hearts beating swiftly in unison. Dantes took note of the fact that they were in the lower east part of Uptown, near where the Church of Many Gods was located. Not a bad place to put a secret meeting place and den of sin. He sent Jacopo what directions he could before limiting his contact, so that Jacopo didn't have him hounding his every step as he moved to return to him. Dantes was sweating profusely and took a long sip of water before collapsing back onto the floor. Godfrey. He was the one who had tempted his old gang into betraying him, and it looked as if he had some way to monitor his current whereabouts as well. That was trouble, though he did seem unwilling to give Mondego exactly what he wanted. Dantes wasn't sure, but he had the distinct sense that Godfrey was playing a very different game with very different stakes than the rest of them were. Dantes clenched his jaw, feeling his small tusks bite into the inside of his cheeks. "Dantes," said Wayne as he approached. "Yeah," he asked, not fully giving Wayne his attention. "We're ready for a lockpick." Dantes stood from his bedroll and flexed his fingers as he moved toward Orbus, Merle, and Felix. It had started to rain, and a light drizzle was falling over the garden, which he sensed that many of the plants enjoyed, though a nearby cat was grumpily licking its fur nearby as it was forced to hide under an old piece of wall. Felix reeked of alcohol, and his eyes were wide as he carved small runes into Merle's collar with a small, jagged piece of metal. "You're going first?" Dantes asked. "Can't ask them to risk what I'm not willing to risk myself." Orbus sighed. "Yes, you could, but arguing about it would be pointless." "What do I need to do?" Felix gestured him closer and pointed at a small indent in the back of it. "This is the locking mechanism. I need to channel energy into the collar, and when I say go, you'll need to unlock it. If you do it too soon or too late, he'll die." "How? His head will explode? Or it jams a knife into his throat?" "No, he'll just die." "Effective. Get on with it," said Merle, kneeling down a bit further and bowing forward. Dantes turned his focus to his branch and had it extend some small, thin pieces into the locking mechanism. It was a very simple lock, which made sense considering the lock itself wasn't the deterrent so much as the enchantment around it. "Okay, let's see." Felix placed his finger on one of the runes on Merle's collar. The rune very slowly began to glow until it was lit in a bright green. He then moved on to the next rune, and then the next. Each of them seemed to be from a completely different alphabets, and each of them was lit a different color after he channeled energy into them. The entire time, Felix muttered different chants and words under his breath. At some points, he seemed to be speaking multiple chants and phrases at once, or leaving strange echoes in the air after certain words, defying natural logic. Dantes felt the tips of his finger begin to tingle more and more strongly as Felix worked, until they began to feel as if they were burning, but he saw no visible burns on his skin. "Now!" yelled Felix suddenly. Dantes quickly undid the mechanism holding the collar, and, with a click, it fell from Earl's thick neck and landed on the ground. Felix fell backwards, panting. Merle sat completely still for a moment, then straightened his back and stood up. His eyes were closed. He took a deep breath through his nose, then exhaled through his mouth. For a moment, all of the rain that was falling seemed to pause where it was in midair. Merle moved his right hand in a gentle motion in front of himself, and the air seemed to distort around it, with the water hitting it turning to steam, as if he was simply adjusting the temperature around his hand. He moved his left hand in a semicircle, and golden runes appeared in the air for just a moment, dancing around it. Dantes had no clue what he was doing, but he knew power when he saw it. He was grateful Merle was a friend and not a foe at that moment. Merle opened his eyes, and they were glowing bright purple. Then he blinked them, and they were back to normal. He turned to look at Felix and held his hand out to him. Felix flinched for a moment, then took the hand and was pulled back onto his feet and into a powerful hug. "The narrative has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the infringement." "You are a truly brilliant mage, Felix. I'd had theories about the collars, worked everything from every angle, but I never would have considered overloading the enchantment and redirecting it like that. Had it novel been at?" Felix nodded, a bit of steel returning to his spine. "I'd be the head of my department if numbers 1 and 2 weren't elves who won't ever age out of their postings." Orbus frowned. "They don't rotate anymore. Not for decades. Another reason the current academy needs to be rebuilt from the ground up," said Merle, rolling his neck while running a hand along where his collar used to be. He looked at Wayne and Orbus. "I should be able to mimic what Felix was doing, but there's no way my hands could pick a lock." "Wayne should be able to do it," responded Dantes. "The lock itself is very simple. Dantes reached into his sleeves to pull out his old, crude, lock-picking set from the Underprison, holding it out to Wayne. "Take these. I have better tools now anyway." Merle nodded. "Thank you, Dantes. None of this would have been possible without you." "True, but I bet you lost some good men to my garden. We'll call this evening the score." Merle nodded. "That being said, I'm certain we can come to some mutually beneficial arrangements, no?" He smiled. "Of that I am certain." He wiggled his fingers a bit, and multicolored sparks drifted off of them. "We may be out of contact for some time. Even with the collars removed, it's dangerous for fugitives out here. We have plans of our own to work towards as well." Dantes hid his disappointment. He knew they would be helpful with his plans, but he also couldn't fault them for having their own priorities beyond helping him with his own revenge. He held out a hand, and Merle clasped it firmly. "Until next time," Merle nodded. "I'll bring some dice. Me and Felix can figure out who has the best luck." Dantes smiled. "I'm happy to take your money." Felix nodded as well. "I'd prefer if we played cards." The collar gathered their things and said their final goodbyes before disappearing back into the city where they could help their members still in hiding. Dantes and Felix were left alone. I can leave, right?" Dantes nodded. "That's right, but I'll see you in 1 week at the Bitter Wife. Bring more of those hammers, and I'll bring you gold for them." "Understood." Felix nodded. "I'll see you then." Felix moved to leave, but hesitated at the exit. I don't know how to get back to the tower from here." After escorting Felix until he reached a road that he recognized, Dantes returned to his garden and waited for Jacopo. Once he arrived, he made sure he had a good meal, then left him there to rest while he began to travel to his other gardens. Clay was doing good work, but Dantes had to make sure that the gardens benefited the animals around them as much as the plants themselves, which seemed to be Clay's biggest blind spot. Still, he did great work, and Dantes left his payment in the dead drop they'd last agreed to. Once he was done, Dantes returned to his main garden and laid out parchment on a flat piece of concrete. He weighed down the corners of it with stones, and then unrolled the letter that Danglars had received from his mother next to it. At a glance, he'd been able to tell that Cornelia was using an old feather pen and inkwell rather than the newer fountain pens that had been common for more than a decade. He'd sourced one of his own, and on the clean parchment he began to write, doing his best to mimic Cornelia's handwriting as did so. He had always been an excellent forger. He had good hands, but Cornelia's handwriting had a number of quirks related to her upbringing and what he guessed was arthritis. Still, after filling a few different sheets with his attempts at mimicry, he thought he'd gotten close enough for a real attempt. For the first one, he simply copied the letter he'd stolen word for word, with no changes, but now on an uncrumpled and clean piece of paper. Once that was done, he folded it neatly and slipped it into his jacket for later. With that written, he moved on to notes that needed no forgery. He sent his thoughts to rats, roaches, and bats he had watching various enterprises of Mondegos in Midtown. Eventually, he settled on a lightly manned gambling den filled with dust. He wrote specific information on it and rolled it into a tight note, then summoned a rat. He tied the note to the rat, along with one of the enchanted keys, and sent him on his way to Pasha. He'd been feeding small, easily verifiable pieces of information to Pasha since the raid on Mondego's warehouse, and Pasha had been taking the bait. He'd even earned himself a promotion, which filled Dantes with a little touch of pride he imagined a parent would feel at a child's success. When he was done writing, he stood and settled next to Jacopo on his bedroll. He needed his rest. The next day, he had plans with Mistress Dorcia at the Cruel Lady. Of course, he didn't intend to participate in the more eccentric options at that particular brothel. At least, probably not. In Uptown, the Cruel Lady stood out. A black building with barred windows and a massive sign with the establishment's name framed by a large black whip. It was flanked by a bookstore with flowers in the window and a bakery filled with frilly cakes. Dantes stepped to the front door of the whorehouse confidently and pushed it open. He wore a fine black coat he'd stolen, as well as a black hat to partially hide his face. In the entryway stood a muscular dwarven woman in a black leather corset wearing heavy eyeshadow and black lipstick. She pointed a riding crop at him as he entered, but he could tell that there was also a pistol hiding in her left boot. "Welcome, Worm." Dantes slipped off his hat and pushed back his hair, smiling at her. "Hello. What is your displeasure?" she asked dramatically. He shrugged, deciding to play along a bit. "I'm not sure yet. This is my first time at a place like this. A virgin, in a sense." She stepped forward and started walking in a circle around him, looking him up and down. "In the only sense that matters." She stopped in front of him and brought the riding crop to his cheek, using gentle force to push it right, and left as she took a good look at him. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I was told by a friend to ask for Doja." She laughed. "Doja? We don't send new meat to Doja." "Well, now, that's exciting." She smiled and looked him up and down again. "Well, I don't think your heart would give out at least." She walked back toward the small podium she'd been standing at when he'd arrived. She looked at it for a few moments and then looked back up at him. "Doja has about an hour between scheduled clients. More than enough for you. Add it novel Benedette. We'll see about that." She chuckled. "If you have any spirit left in you after seeing her, I'd happily be the one to break you." Dantes leaned forward on the podium. "Well, now, I'm very incentivized to make it." She smirked. "Head straight back. Doja's chamber is the one at the end of the hall on the left." Dantes took a silver and placed it on the podium. "Thank you." He then walked out of the entryway and into the long hall behind it. He could hear the sound of whip cracks, screams, and moans drifting from each of the rooms as he walked through them. Coming the opposite way was a man wearing nothing but a goblin mask, crawling on all fours. Dantes gave him a smile and a nod, and the man nodded back as if the meeting was the most casual thing in the mortal plane. Dantes reached Doja's room and let himself in without knocking. In spite of that, he found her ready for him, likely warned by the dwarven woman at the entrance of him. Dantes could tell immediately that she was a half-orc, half-elf without a drop of human in her. Her skin was a dark green that contrasted pleasantly with the deep red leather outfit she wore. She was muscular, tall, and beautiful, with her tusks capped with gold points, each of which had a ruby embedded within them. Her eyes were bright orange, and she held a whip in her hand. She lifted the whip and wrapped it slowly around her arm as she approached him, causing it to groan as it tightened. As she did so, Dantes peered around the room. The walls were painted dark red, and the ceiling was high, with a large canopied bed covered in black bedding against the far wall. Along the wall to his right were manacles, a rack, and some kind of wooden X with straps for what he assumed were arms and legs. On the other wall were whips and paddles, but also hooks, knives, and lovingly recreated representations of parts that would have made a less worldly man blush. The author's content has been appropriated. Report any instances of this story on Amazon. Doja took the whip handle and drove it into Dantes' shoulder. "Kneel." He complied. "Fresh meat," she muttered as she circled him before swiftly taking the handle of the whip and bringing him back to his feet, her breath hot in his ear. "It's been a while since I've been able to break someone new in." She loosened the handle just enough so that he could breathe. "Do you have any particular requests before we get started? Or are you just here to test your limits?" Dantes hesitated, which he had not expected to do, and briefly considered just seeing where things would go. Then his eyes drifted to some of the more exotic things on the far wall, and he decided that in spite of his upbringing, he had his limits. Poison. That's interesting. It's been some time since I had a request like that. I can find something that'll make you feel as if your eyes are melting or make you into putty in my hands. I could even put you in a cage and turn you feral with lust while I dash. Oh, not for me. She loosened her grip slightly. Glass didn't tell me you had a partner with you. Dantes pushed the whip off his throat, almost reluctantly, and turned around to face her. Oh, it's no one with me. It's a client of yours named Danglars. She shifted her footing and pulled a dagger from a secret sheath on her corset, pointing it at Dantes. Who the hells are you? Dantes held up his hands. I work for another magister, one who has recently been insulted by Danglars. I hurt people for a living, I don't kill them. Dantes smiled. You won't need to kill him. The poison I want you to use on him will only make him paranoid and anxious. My client intends to destroy him in the courtroom or the grand meeting chambers, not kill him. The tip of Doja's dagger dipped slightly. Violet Prosa? She asked. Dantes nodded. reaching into his jacket to pull out a large jar of the powdered mushroom. "You're familiar." She nodded. "I've used it myself. Wailing on clients for hours can leave my arms near useless." She paused for a few moments. "What are you offering?" "Gold." "I don't know." He's a regular client. A regular client that's often behind on what he owes you. When he does pay you, the house takes more than half anyway. When's the last time you received an actual gold from him? She frowned. "How do you know that?" "It's my job to know. You don't work in Uptown without the ability to gather information." Her brow furrowed, marring her beautifully intimidating features for a moment. He didn't need to go this route. He considered a number of other options to poison Danglars. He could send in rats with enchanted keys to his home to poison any of his alcohol, or work with his clearly dissatisfied secretaries to do it, but he'd settled on going through Doja for a number of reasons. For one, the doses needed to be given regularly, and while he might be able to manage that using rats, he didn't know when his attention might need to be focused elsewhere, or he'd be forced to use up his favor. Danglars seemed to have absolute power of his secretaries, which made the betrayal too obvious for Dantes' tastes, besides which he wasn't certain of their ability to be discreet. Doja was a whore, discretion was her business, and would have complete control of Danglars during their sessions. That, and the sweetness of having him betrayed by someone whose job was to comfort him, made Doja his first choice. Doja sheathed her dagger. "How much gold are we talking about?" she asked. Dantes smiled, and they jumped into negotiations. She was shrewd, which he had expected, and by the end of it he wound up paying outside of his expectations, but it was a price he could live with. Once they were done, he handed her the powdered mushroom and the gold. "I'll be watching to make sure you're keeping up your end of the bargain. I'll be setting a regular appointment with you under the name Cornelius." She nodded and moved to the wall, grabbing a thick bamboo cane. "If you're going to pretend to be a regular, we're going to need to make this look good." Dantes frowned, eyeing the cane. "Any chance you offer some more vanilla services?" She smiled and shook her head. "No, only Glass and a few others do that." Dantes frowned and started slipping off his coat. "Well, maybe a visit with her after this will make me feel better." Dantes left the cruel lady with a sore back and a much lighter pocket, but felt overall happy with what he'd arranged. He shifted into a rat in an alley nearby and made his way to the administrative district of the city. Danglars wasn't in his office, and his secretaries were at their respective desks in the office next to his. Dantes climbed the wall as a roach and squeezed through a small hole in the roof near his office before skittering into Danglars' locked office. He hadn't been able to fit under the door as a rat, but as a roach with the anti-vermin enchantment breaking key on his person, it was much easier. He shifted back to himself and made his way to the desk and placed the forged copy of the letter from Danglars' mother neatly on the desk, smoothing it out so that it was visible immediately. He smiled. Between the poison and the letters Danglars was about to start receiving from his mother, Dantes had a feeling he was going to be having a very rough time as a magister.